She did not scream when they dragged her across the marble floor. That was the part nobody could explain afterward. Not the chamberlains who averted their eyes. Not the guards whose hands trembled inside their gauntlets. Not even Lucien Ravenscar himself, the most feared duke in an empire built on the bones of lesser men. She did not scream. She looked at him. And in that silence, in the space between what he had chosen and what he had destroyed, something ancient and irrevocable passed from her eyes to his. Not a curse, not a plea. Something quieter. Something that would take him 5 years, the ruin of everything he loved, and one small boy's face to finally understand. This is the story of what a man loses when he mistakes power for wisdom, obsession for love, and silence for consent. Watch carefully. The ending will not be what you expect. But that's... Part 1. The Night of Wolves and Marble. The winter banquet of the Ravenscar Empire was not a celebration. It had never been, not truly. Not in the 40 years since the tradition was codified under Emperor Aldrich III. Not in the 12 years since Lucien Caedric Ravenscar had inherited the duchy and transformed the annual gathering from a diplomatic courtesy into something closer to a demonstration of force. The chandeliers burned with 600 candles each, imported beeswax from the southern colonies, and their light fell across 200 of the empire's most powerful men and women with the particular cruelty of illumination that exposes rather than flatters. Every gown was a calculation, every seating arrangement, a chess move 3 seasons in the making. The musicians in the gallery played Valdressian court compositions with mechanical precision, and the sound drifted through the great hall of Ravenscar Palace like something beautiful that had long since forgotten what beauty was for. Celine Ashbourne Ravenscar had dressed for survival. Not in the way her ladies-in-waiting understood the word. They had laced her into a gown of deep midnight blue silk, the kind of blue that existed somewhere between the ocean at full depth and the sky in the last moment before total darkness. And they had threaded silver wire through her dark hair until she looked like something the old poets might have written about, if the old poets had possessed sufficient nerve. She wore the Ravenscar diamonds at her throat, 3 cascading drops of cold fire that had adorned the neck of every duchess in the line, going back to the dynasty's founding, and her reflection in the dressing room mirror had looked back at her with the expression of a woman who understood precisely how much all of this regalia meant, and how quickly meaning could be stripped away. She was 19 weeks pregnant. She had told Lucien 3 months ago in the private study where he kept his military maps and his collection of pre-empire manuscripts, and he had looked at her with an expression she had spent those 3 months attempting to correctly read. Not joy. She had not expected joy. Not precisely. Not from a man who processed every significant event through the filter of its strategic implications. Not indifference either, though she had braced for that. Something more complicated. Something that had seemed in the weak afternoon light of that October afternoon, like a man standing at the edge of a decision he had not yet made. She had not told him she was afraid. That was the first mistake. Or perhaps it was not a mistake at all, but simply the particular kind of self-protection that becomes habitual in women who have spent years inside households where showing vulnerability is equivalent to handing someone a weapon. Celine had learned that lesson early, in her father's house in the Ashbourne territories, where love was expressed primarily through expectation and disappointment, was a language everyone spoke fluently. She had carried that education into her marriage with the efficiency of someone who has never known anything different, and she had built around herself a composure so complete and so apparently effortless that even the women who hated her could not find a seam in it. Viviane Castrel could find seams. That was her particular gift. Celine had watched Viviane across the hall for the better part of an hour before the dinner service began, the way a soldier on unfamiliar ground watches the tree line. Not with panic, but with the focused attention of someone who knows that the next few hours will require every instrument of perception she possesses. Viviane moved through the gathering in a gown of pale gold that managed to suggest simultaneously the innocence of morning light and the calculated presentation of a woman who has spent years understanding what men respond to when their rational faculties are compromised by wine and pride and desire. She was 23 years old, and she laughed at the right moments and touched men's arms when she made her points, and had been the Duke's mistress for 14 months. 14 months. Celine knew the exact count because she was a woman who had always known the exact count. The way you know the depth of a wound, not because you enjoy measuring it, but because accurate information is the only thing that keeps you from making fatal errors in your response. The dinner began at 8. By 9, the wine had done its work on the room. That particular transformation where 200 calculating people gradually become 200 people with slightly less capacity to conceal their calculations, which is a different thing from honesty, but is often mistaken for it. Lucien sat at the head of the high table and occupied the space the way he occupied every space he entered, completely. He was 34 years old, and he had the physical quality of a man who had spent his 20s in military campaigns and his early 30s learning to weaponize stillness. And the combination produced something that most people in his presence experienced as authority. So total, it registered in the body before it reached the mind. He had not looked at Celine once since the seating arrangements had placed her 6 chairs down on his left. She had noticed. She always noticed. And she had spent the soup course and most of the first remove constructing behind her composed expression, the precise nature of what his studied non-attention meant tonight specifically, because it was different from his ordinary variety of inattention, which was simply the inattention of a man consumed by empire and strategy and the 1,000 administrative demands of governing a duchy the size of a small country. This was pointed. This was the deliberate maintenance of a blind spot, which requires more energy than looking, and the energy expenditure told her something was coming. She did not know it would come as fast as it did. It was Councillor Marin Duval who initiated it. Marin, who was 60 years old and had served the court since before Lucien was born, and who understood political theater the way master carpenters understand load-bearing walls. She stood during the natural pause between the second and third removes, which was a mildly transgressive thing to do, and the room absorbed her standing with the attentive silence that gathers whenever someone does something slightly outside the established choreography. "Your Grace," Marin said, addressing Lucien with the particular formality that signals a performance about to begin, "I feel it is my duty, given the gravity of the matter, to raise before this assembled court a concern that has been brought to my attention by multiple witnesses of impeccable character." The musicians stopped. They were well trained enough to recognize a scene change. Celine set down her wine glass. She did it very carefully, with the controlled precision of someone who understands that every gesture is being observed and catalogued and will be reproduced in the stories people tell about this night for years afterward. The glass made no sound against the tablecloth. Her face remained what it always was, composed, somewhat cool, the face of a woman who has learned that being unreadable is a form of armor. But behind that face, something cold and very fast moved through her like the first water that seeps through a crack before the structure gives. She knew, not the specifics, not yet, not the particular shape of the accusation or the evidence they had assembled, or the way Viviane had spent the last 3 months building this moment with the patient, architectural care of someone constructing a trap that must hold under pressure. But she knew in the way that living things know when something fundamental has shifted, the way animals know weather before instruments detect it. The air in the room had changed, and the change was aimed at her. "There have been credible reports," Marin continued, and her voice was the voice of a woman reading a prepared statement while performing spontaneous concern, a combination that requires real skill, corroborated by testimony from Lady Harwick, Lord Fenner, and 3 members of the household staff, that the Duchess of Ravenscar has been engaging in the practice of forbidden sympathetic magic. Specifically, and here she paused, because the pause was part of it. The pause was where the audience's imagination was invited to produce horrors more vivid than anything she could offer. Specifically, magic directed against the person of Lady Viviane Castrel, resulting in documented illness, sustained migraines of supernatural origin, and what the court mage's preliminary assessment describes as evidence of a binding hex. The silence that followed was the specific silence of 200 people holding their breath simultaneously. Celine heard it like a physical sensation, the weight of that collective suspension pressing against her from every direction, and she understood in the same moment that the weight was not neutral. 200 people in a room will always, in the presence of an accusation, arrange themselves instinctively on a spectrum between belief and skepticism, and the arrangement is determined not by evidence, but by what each person in the room needs the truth to be. She looked down the table at the faces she had spent 2 years learning, the faces of the court she had married into, and she watched the arrangements happen in real time. Most of them needed it to be true. "That's a lie." She said it before she had decided to say it. That was the second mistake. Or perhaps, again, it was not a mistake, but simply the involuntary response of a body that has reached the absolute limit of sustained performance, The moment where the architecture of composure finally makes contact with something that cannot be composed around. Her voice was steady. That surprised her. It came out flat and hard and certain, without tremor, without the elevated pitch of panic, and it landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Every head turned, including Lucien's. He looked at her finally, and his face was the face she had dreaded seeing for 3 months, not the complex face of the man she had glimpsed occasionally in unguarded moments. The man who read pre-Empire manuscripts at midnight and sometimes stood at his study window watching weather with an expression she could never quite interpret. This face was the public face, the Duke's face, the face of a man who has already made his decision and is now simply executing the formality of appearing to consider it. "You will be given the opportunity to speak," he said, and his voice was the voice he used in military debriefings, controlled, impersonal, with the specific cadence of authority that admits no appeal. "I'm speaking now." She stood. The movement pulled at the weight of her pregnancy, the slight shift in her center of balance that she had spent weeks learning to compensate for. And she was aware of that, aware of the visibility of it, aware that the swell of her abdomen under the midnight blue silk was visible to every person in this room, and that visibility was simultaneously her greatest vulnerability and the only thing that should have mattered. She looked directly at Lucien. "I am speaking now, and I am telling you that every word of this accusation is fabricated. I have practiced no magic, forbidden or otherwise, against anyone in this court. I don't have the ability. My abilities are documented. They're on record with the court mages going back to our betrothal, and there is not a single mage in this empire who will certify that I have the range for sympathetic binding work. That documentation is 3 years old," Marin said, still calm, still reading from the internal script. "Then have me tested, tonight. Have Cassian test me right now, in front of every person in this room, and let the results speak." The suggestion fell into the room and she watched it land, watched the brief flicker of something uncomfortable pass across Marin's face, watched Vivienne across the table and 3 seats down turn slightly toward Lucien with an expression of pained distress so perfectly calibrated that Celine felt something close to professional admiration for the craftsmanship of it, even now, even standing here with the ground dissolving under her feet. Vivienne said, very softly, in the voice of someone attempting restraint and visibly failing, "Your Grace, I don't think I can sit at the same table as the woman who—" And then she stopped, pressed her fingers to her mouth, and let the incomplete sentence do its work. It did its work. Lucien looked at Vivienne for 4 seconds. Celine counted. Then he looked back at Celine, and she saw it happen. The thing she had been afraid of without allowing herself to be afraid of it. The thing she had spent 3 months telling herself was not possible in a man of his intelligence and political instinct. She watched him choose. Not the evidence, not the documented record of her magical classification, not the 14 years of clean history, the 2 years of marriage during which she had managed his household and navigated his court and carried herself with sufficient dignity that even his enemies had nothing credible to say against her character. Not any of that. He chose Vivienne's unfinished sentence and the 4 seconds of eye contact that preceded it. "Clear the hall," he said. "Lucien," his name in her mouth. Not "Your Grace," not the formal address she used in public, but his name, the sound of it naked and direct. An attempt at the private register, the only register that might still reach something real in him. "I am carrying your child. I am carrying our child, and whatever you believe about me right now, whatever she has told you, clear the hall," he said again, to the room, to the guards, to everyone except her, and his voice had not changed at all. It took 6 minutes for 200 people to leave a room. Celine stood through all 6 minutes with her hands flat against the front of her skirt, feeling the small, insistent pressure of her abdomen against her palms, and she watched people file past her with expressions ranging from avoidance to pity to the bright, avid gaze of those who were already rehearsing what they would say about this at other dinner tables in other houses. The musicians went with their instruments. The servants went. Lord Fenner went without looking at her, and she noted that and filed it with everything else she was noting. The granular, desperate information gathering of a person who understands she is about to need every piece of intelligence she can collect. Marne Duval left last, after making brief eye contact with Vivienne, and that eye contact told Celine a great deal about the architecture of what had been built in these 3 months, more than she had known before tonight, more than she had allowed herself to suspect. 3 people remained in the hall. Herself, Lucien, Vivienne. The 600 candles burned. The winter beyond the tall windows pressed its darkness against the glass. Celine could hear, very faintly, the sound of wind in the courtyard trees. "You need to send her out of this room," Celine said. She kept her voice level. She was very good at keeping her voice level. "Whatever conversation we are about to have, it needs to happen without her present, because she is the source of every lie you've been told, and having her in the room while you decide what to do about those lies is—" "She stays," Lucian said. He had moved to the head of the table. He stood there now with his hands behind his back and his shoulders square in the way they squared when he was executing a settled decision, not deliberating, not open to new information. She had seen him stand like that in treaty negotiations. She had seen him stand like that when he dismissed men from positions they had held for decades. The posture was the posture of an ending. "Then I want to know what evidence you have," Celine said. "Specific evidence, not testimony from people who benefit from my removal. Physical evidence. What has Cassian found?" "Cassian has been excused from his duties pending review of his own conduct." The cold thing inside her moved again, faster. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that his long-standing familiarity with you may have compromised his assessments." She looked at him for a long moment. "You removed the only court mage who would give you an honest reading before you held this hearing." "I convened no hearing. This is a conversation." "This is not a conversation." The level voice cracked slightly on the last word, not with emotion, but with the stress fracture of a structure bearing more weight than its design accommodates. And she heard the crack and registered it and continued because there was no longer any advantage to perfect composure. "Lucien, you have not spoken to me privately in 6 weeks. You have not responded to my request for an audience. You have had me managed by your secretariat like a petition from a minor landowner, and now you have stood me up in front of your entire court, and you cursed her." His voice, for the first time, had something in it besides controlled authority, something hot and immediate beneath the surface that the authority was barely containing. "You cursed her because she carries—" He stopped. The stop was more damning than anything he might have said. Celine heard it land between them and expand to fill the space. She said quietly, "Say it." His jaw tightened. "Say it," she said again. "She carries what, Lucien? What is it that she's carrying that I should apparently have had sufficient motive to risk everything I have and everything our child has on a binding hex, which is, I will remind you, a capital offense in this empire?" The silence stretched for 3 seconds. 4, 5. Vivienne, across the room, had gone very still in the way prey animals go still. Not the stillness of safety, but the stillness of extreme attention to a scene that might still develop in multiple directions. "It doesn't matter," Lucian said. "It matters enormously." Celine took 3 steps toward him across the empty marble floor, her footsteps very loud in the hollowed-out hall, and stopped at a distance that required him to look directly at her. "Because if what I think is true, if she is telling you she is pregnant, if that is the thing you cannot say out loud right now, then you understand exactly why this accusation exists tonight, and you understand exactly who benefits from it, and you're standing there anyway." Something moved in his face. She watched it move and she thought for one suspended, terrible second that it was the thing she needed, the thing that would break through, the moment of honest recognition that precedes a man reversing a bad decision before it becomes an irreversible one. She had seen that moment happen in him before, rare and brief, in the dark of their bedroom when they were only 2 people and the Empire could not hear. Then Vivienne made a sound. It was a small sound, not dramatic. She was too skilled for that. A slight intake of breath, involuntary seeming, the sound of a woman maintaining composure against considerable odds, and it pulled Lucien's gaze across the room with the mechanical certainty of a compass needle finding north, and Celine watched the moment close. She had stopped taking steps toward him. "Your title will be suspended pending full investigation," Lucicia said. He was looking at the middle distance now, the practiced gaze of someone who has learned to deliver verdicts without making eye contact with their consequences. "You will be moved to the east wing of the estate while the investigation proceeds. Maids will be reassigned. You will retain basic provisions. When the investigation concludes—" "Where will I be when the investigation concludes?" she said. "And who is conducting it?" He didn't answer. "Lucien." She said his name again, and this time it was not an appeal to the private register. This time it was the sound of a woman pressing her thumb against a wound to feel the full depth of it. Tell me who is conducting the investigation. The council. The council that Marin Duval convened tonight. The council. The Imperial Council, yes. She looked at him for a long time, looked at the line of his jaw and the set of his shoulders and the deliberate refusal of his eyes to meet hers, and she thought about the 14 months she had been watching this happen. The slow, systematic erosion of her position, the whisper campaigns she had tracked through their social geometry, the way certain invitations had quietly stopped arriving and certain doors had grown incrementally less immediate in their opening. She had watched it, and she had told herself she was managing it, and she had believed that right up until this moment, when it became clear she had been watching the visible surface of something with far deeper foundations. "My child," she said. "What happens to my child during the investigation?" The pause before he answered was 4 seconds long, and it told her everything. "The child's status will be determined as part of the investigation." She breathed once, very slowly, feeling the weight of it settle over the room and over her body and over the child inside her body with the specific, suffocating weight of things that cannot be undone. The candles burned. The wind moved the trees in the dark courtyard. She stood in the ruins of a life she had spent 2 years building with insufficient information about the ground it was being built on. Then she said simply and clearly, and with no further inflection, "You will regret this." Not a curse, not a threat, just the statement of a woman who has arrived, through the instrument of absolute present moment clarity, at a fact. Lucienne said nothing. She was still standing straight-backed and composed when the guards came in through the hall's east entrance. 4 of them, which was 2 more than were necessary, and told her something about how seriously they had assessed the possibility of her resistance. She recognized one of them, a man named Aldrich, who had guarded her apartments for 18 months, and who had brought her once an extra blanket during a cold night without being asked, and she watched him enter the room now with his eyes fixed at a point 6 inches above her head, and she understood that he would not be the thing that saved her. Nothing in this room would be. She walked with the guards without being touched. They had the good sense not to reach for her, or perhaps just the human instinct that flinches from contact with someone in the process of being destroyed. And she did not look back at Lucienne, and she did not look at Vivienne, and she did not give either of them the retrospective satisfaction of an expression that could be described as breaking. But she felt it. She was human enough for that. Whatever performance she was maintaining on the surface, below the surface, she was feeling the structural failure in real time. The way a building feels its own collapse before the exterior shows it. The deep internal recognition that the thing you built your life around has shown you, finally, its true composition. She had 3 months of pregnancy left. She had no allies in this estate whose loyalty she would now trust with her life. She had the clothes on her body and the diamonds at her throat, and the child she was carrying and the particular quality of mind she had spent 19 years developing, the one that cataloged information and assessed terrain and found, even in situations of severe resource constraint, the next viable move. She would need all of it. The east wing was locked behind her. She heard the key turn. She sat on the edge of a bed in a room that smelled faintly of disuse and listened to the guards take their positions outside the door, and she pressed her hands flat against her abdomen, and in the silence of that room she permitted herself 60 seconds, exactly 60, she counted, of the full weight of what had just happened, the fear of it, the grief of it, the specific animal terror of a pregnant woman in a locked room in a house full of people who have decided she is expendable. She let it move through her completely, without resistance, because she had learned early that the fastest way past a thing is through it, and that 60 seconds of honest reckoning is infinitely more efficient than weeks of managed denial. Then she stood up. She went to the window and looked out at the east courtyard, assessing sight lines and guard positions and the geometry of the estate's perimeter. She went to the fireplace and found it cold and laid on the floor beside it because the floor retained more heat than the bed. She catalogued her physical condition with clinical precision. Fatigue, yes. The persistent ache in her lower back that had been there for 3 weeks. The child's movement, still regular, still reassuring in its ordinariness. She was hungry. She had not eaten since late afternoon. Nobody brought food. She had expected that. She had not expected how long the night would be. It was very long. Winter dark comes early and stays, and the night stretched out with the particular cruelty of time in conditions of stress, where the mind has too much to process and too little to act on, and the body has nothing to do but exist inside its own fear. She lay on the floor beside the cold fireplace, and she thought about every conversation she'd had in the past 14 months. not with the self-flagellating purpose of identifying her failures, but with the cold inventory taking of someone determining the full extent of what had been built against her, and who had helped build it, and where the foundations were weakest. She thought about Cassian. The old mage, retired to his tower at the estate's north corner, officially emeritus, kept on largely because Lucien had some residual respect for his father's chief advisor and preferred the liability of his continued presence to the complicated optics of removing him. She had spoken with Cassian perhaps 30 times in 2 years, brief, careful conversations, because she had understood even then that any friendship she openly cultivated would be used against her. But she had listened to him carefully, those 30 conversations. She had noted things. She thought, if there is one person in this estate whose self-interest is not aligned with hers and Vivian's interests, it is a 70-year-old mage who has survived 4 ducal administrations by being more politically inconvenient to remove than to maintain, and who has spent that career developing the kind of professional expertise that makes lying to him about magical evidence essentially impossible. She thought, he knows. If he was removed before this hearing, it's because they knew he would say something that destroyed their case, which means they understand the evidence is fabricated, which means at least one person in this conspiracy is aware of the full shape of what they're doing. She thought, I need him to know I'm here. She did not sleep. Around 3 in the morning, by the quality of the silence, she heard the first sound. A guard's footstep in the corridor, irregular, someone shifting weight during a long cold post. The sound told her there was 1 guard, not 2. The second had either been reassigned or had gone to find warmth. She filed that. The window faced the interior courtyard, no possibility of unobserved egress. The door was the only exit and a single guard remained on it. Around 4, she began to be cold in a way that went past discomfort into the register that the body takes seriously. The room had no fuel for the fireplace, and the winter had pressed itself fully against the glass, and she had spent 2 hours on a stone floor in a formal gown, and she was pregnant, and the cold was the kind that concentrates first in the extremities and moves inward with deliberate efficiency. She thought about the child. She thought about what sustained hypothermia does to pregnancy outcomes, and she thought about it without panic, converting it instead into urgency, which is the more useful form of the same information. She used the sheet from the bed, wrapped herself in it, sat with her back against the wall where the old fireplace had retained the most residual warmth, calculated. She did not call out for the guard. She understood with complete clarity that calling out would accomplish nothing except confirm her distress to people who were hoping for exactly that, and who were in some cases possibly counting on it. What she needed was not a response to distress. What she needed was a path to Cassian's tower, and for that she needed to wait for the shift change. And for the shift change she needed to survive the next 3 hours. And for that she needed to be smarter than the cold. She was smarter than the cold. She thought about the child's name. She had been thinking about names for weeks, turning them over in her mind the way you test objects for structural integrity, pressing them with questions of how they would feel in the mouth of a person in extremity. The name you say when you are frightened, the name you say when you are proud, the full range of registers a name must survive to be worthy of a life. She had a short list. She returned to it now, pressing each name against the cold and the darkness and the specific circumstances of its present contemplation. And she found that the exercise worked the way it was supposed to work. It called something forward in her, something that was neither resignation nor false optimism, but something more fundamental, the primal, clarifying weight of a life that depends on you. Her child was not going to be born in this room. That was not a wish. It was a structural, load-bearing fact that she was building the rest of her calculations around. The way engineers begin with the non-negotiable weight-bearing elements and design everything else in relation to them. Her child was not going to be born in this room, and she was going to make every decision that remained available to her tonight in service of that fact. And the decision started now. She tore a strip from the bottom of the sheet, long, narrow, deliberate. She began to work on the window's inner latch mechanism with the silver wire she removed from her hair, 1 strand at a time, because she had paid attention, over the course of 2 years, to the mechanical features of this estate's older wing, and she knew that the east wing windows operated on a different latch system than the main building, an older system, installed 50 years before the current security protocols were designed, and therefore not included in the security briefings that Lucien's guards received. The latch moved at 4:47 in the morning. She pushed the window open 2 inches, felt the full assault of winter air against her face, and breathed it deliberately. letting the cold clarify rather than defeat her. The east courtyard below was empty except for the single lamp at the south gate, burning low. The north tower was visible from here, Cassian's windows, dark, but dark in the way of a person asleep rather than absent, the kind of dark that has a human quality to it. 140 feet. Across open ground in the dark of a winter night, in a formal gown, 19 weeks pregnant, with a single guard at her door, who might decide to check her room at any moment, and whose likely response to finding the window open would be to raise an alarm that would bring every guard in the estate to the north tower before she reached it. She breathed the cold air and did the calculation. Then she did something she had not done in 2 years of careful, managed, composed survival inside this marriage and this court, and this life that had been built on insufficient foundations. She stopped calculating and she moved. The window was just wide enough. The drop to the courtyard ledge was 6 feet, manageable. She had always been physically capable in ways her formal presentation concealed. She lowered herself from the sill with both hands gripping the stone, felt the cold of it against her palms, felt the weight of her body and the child's weight, and the momentum of a decision that could not be recalled, and she dropped. The impact took her to one knee. She stayed still for 3 seconds, listening. The guard at her door did not move. The lamp at the south gate burned on in its indifference. She straightened. She pulled the sheet tight around her shoulders. She started across the courtyard toward the north tower. One step, then another. Her breath making small white shapes in the winter dark. Her footsteps deliberately light on the frozen ground. And above her the sky was the particular black of deep winter with no clouds, and every star visible. And she moved through it like something that has decided, finally, to stop asking for permission. She was 40 feet from the tower door when she heard it. Not behind her. Not the sound she had been listening for. The raised voice, the door alarm, the shout from the east wing. This came from the left, from the stable block that backed against the estate's inner wall. And it was a sound she had never heard from that direction before, and therefore it stopped her cold for the 2 seconds it took her brain to categorize it. Voices. Multiple. Low and rapid. The specific register of people engaged in urgent communication they do not want overheard. She should have continued to the tower. Every calculation she had made in the last 3 hours pointed to the tower, to Cassian, to the single remaining person on this estate who was both knowledgeable enough to matter and positioned outside the architecture of what Vivienne had built. She knew this. She took 2 more steps toward the tower door. Then she heard her name, not called, spoken. Quietly, by a voice she recognized as belonging to one of the household stewards, a man named Perrin who had managed the estate's domestic staff for a decade, and the sound of her name in his mouth, here, in the dark, at this hour, in this configuration of voices she was not supposed to hear, sent a different category of cold through her. She stopped. She stood in the dark between the tower door and the stable wall, and she made the decision that changed everything. Not the escape through the window, not the walk across the courtyard, not any of the decisions she had made in the past 6 hours. But this one. This small lateral step toward the stable wall and the voices she was not supposed to hear, this decision to know. She pressed herself against the stone and listened. What she heard took 43 seconds. And when it was finished, when she understood the full shape of what she was hearing, not Vivienne's fabricated accusations, not a mistress securing her position against a wife, but something larger and older and more deliberate, something that had been in construction for months, something that involved names she had not expected and resources she had not imagined, and a purpose that extended far past the ruin of one duchess. She felt the ground shift under her feet for the second time that night. But this time it did not feel like loss. This time it felt like understanding. She was still standing against the stable wall, the cold eating through the sheet and the silk and the careful armor of a composed woman's face finally showing its cracks, when she heard the door at the top of the stable loft open and the light of a single lantern found her. And in the lantern's unsteady circle, an old man's face looked down at her, and then the old man descended the loft ladder with surprising speed for his years, and he said nothing at all for a long moment, only stood before her in the dark with the lantern held high, and his eyes moving across her face and down and back up, with the rapid, precise assessment of a man who has spent 50 years reading situations that other people have been trained not to see. Then Cassian said very quietly, "How much did you hear?" And she said, "Enough." He looked at her for 3 more seconds. Then he looked at her abdomen, then back at her face. And something crossed his expression that she could not name. Not pity. She would not accept pity. She had never asked for pity in her life. But something adjacent to it, something that had more anger in it than she expected. Then we don't have much time, he said. What I'm about to tell you, you need to hear it before we move, because once we're moving, there will be no time for it, and you'll need to know it to understand why you cannot come back. Not tonight. Not for a long time. She stared at him. What are you talking about? Come back from where? He set the lantern down on the ground between them. He looked old, she thought. Older than she had ever noticed him looking, though she had been looking at him carefully for 2 years. Old and very tired and carrying something heavy. Lady Celine, he said, the charges tonight were not about Vivienne. I know that. No, he said, gently but precisely. You don't, not yet. What you heard against that wall, that was part of it. But there's more. And it goes higher than you think. And when I tell you, you're going to want to go back into that estate and set it on fire. And you cannot do that. Not tonight. Not with... His eyes moved briefly down. Not in your condition. She held very still. The cold pushed in from every direction. Tell me, she said. He looked at her for a long moment in the lantern light. This woman standing straight-backed in the ruins of her formal gown at 5 in the morning, in the freezing dark, silver wire still trailing from one side of her loosened hair, her eyes completely steady. The Duke, he said carefully, received a letter 7 weeks ago. A letter that was not what it appeared to be. From whom? From a source he trusted absolutely. A source that had been cultivated for this purpose for over a year. He stopped, started again. The letter contained evidence. Fabricated, but technically convincing. I would have recognized the fabrication immediately, which is why I was removed from consideration before tonight. The letter indicated that your pregnancy was not the result of... Don't, she said. He stopped. She breathed once. Don't say it. He was quiet. Tell me who wrote the letter, she said. He told her. And for the first time that night, in the dark stable yard of the estate that had condemned her, with her child moving inside her, and the cold pressing in from all sides, and the sound of those voices still echoing against the interior of her skull, Celine Ashbourne Ravenscar closed her eyes. Not in grief, not in defeat. In the particular internal silence of a person who has received the last piece of information required to understand fully and completely the nature of the war they are in. When she opened her eyes, something had changed in her face. Cassian saw it. He picked up the lantern. We need to leave now, he said. Yes, she said, and she followed him into the dark, away from the palace and the marble and the 600 candles and the husband who had stood at the head of his table and chosen silence while she was destroyed. Away from everything she had been, away from the name she had been given and the title she had worn and the composed, careful, managed self she had built over 19 years as armor against a world that had never once, not once, made her feel safe without it. She walked into the dark, and the woman who walked into that dark was not the same woman who had stood in the hall 3 hours earlier, not entirely. Something had been burned away. Something else had taken its place. She would not know its name for 5 years. The Empire would know it before she did. What Cassian told her in the stable yard, the name he gave her, the origin of the letter, the full shape of the conspiracy that stretched from Vivienne's ambition to a source none of them had suspected, that information does not vanish into the night with Celine. It begins, in that moment, to grow. The name Cassian gave her was Lord Edric Voss. She knew the name. That was the thing. She knew it immediately, without the lag of confusion or the cushion of disbelief, which told her something about where she already was by the time he said it. Edric Voss. Privy Councillor to the Imperial Court, third in the line of succession to the Imperial Administrative Chair, a man she had sat across from at dinner tables 12 times in 2 years, and who had always been courteous, always been measured, always offered her the particular variety of formal respect that functions as its own form of invisibility. She had noted him, filed him, never elevated him to threat status. That was the failure. Not the only one, but the one she stood with now, in the dark of the stable yard at 5 in the morning, feeling the full dimensions of it. How long? She said. The cultivation of Vivienne's position? At minimum, 22 months. Cassian held the lantern low. keeping the light off their faces. The letter was the culmination, not the beginning. Everything before it, the rumors, the social erosion, the timing of the pregnancy announcement, those were setup work. For what purpose? He looked at her steadily. The heir. She let that settle. Let it do its full work on her, the complete shape of it, because there was no advantage in receiving partial information, and she needed every dimension of this. The heir. Not Vivian's position, not even Lucien's political future. The heir of House Ravenscar, which was the second most powerful duchy in the empire, whose bloodline carried specific legal rights to the imperial succession in the event of a vacancy, whose military resources would become, in the right hands, the determining factor in any power contest that followed an imperial transition, her child. He needed the Ravenscar heir to be born of the right mother, she said. Not a question. He needed the Ravenscar heir to be born of a mother he controls. Cassian's voice was flat and careful, the voice of a man delivering a technical briefing on something that has made him sick. Vivian's family is 3 generations deep in Voss's network. The child she's carrying, if she is in fact carrying one, which I believe she is, that child becomes the lever. The legitimate heir discredited or dead, the Duke's alliance redirected through Vivian to Voss. And in 18 months, when the imperial transition question becomes unavoidable, House Ravenscar moves in the direction Voss points it. Celine breathed once, long and deliberate, feeling the cold of it moving down into her chest, converting it into something she could use. Lucien doesn't know, she said. Lucien knows what he was given to know. That's not what I asked. Cassian was quiet for 2 seconds. No, he doesn't know. She looked at the tower door 20 feet away, looked at the estate wall beyond it, its height and composition visible even in the dark, because she had looked at it 100 times in ordinary circumstances and retained the information. She looked at the stable door behind her, the one she had pressed against while she listened to Perrin's voice, explaining logistics to someone she had not been able to identify. What was Perrin being told to do? She said. Another pause, shorter this time. Ensure that if the investigation proceeds without producing the outcome they need, which in practical terms means a miscarriage or a stillbirth or a child born with insufficient documentation to support legitimacy, there are contingency measures in place. She held very still. Where do you need to go? Cassian said quietly. Right now, not eventually. Right now. She turned to look at him. He was watching her with the particular expression of an old man who has witnessed a great deal of suffering and has developed neither immunity to it nor the habit of looking away from it. She thought about what it cost him to still be here, still in this estate, still nominally under the authority of a duke who had just removed him from his official position, still carrying information that, if shared with the wrong person, would make him substantially less than alive. He had come to the stable loft tonight on purpose, not accidentally, not because he happened to be sleepless and wandering. He had come here specifically with his lantern and opened that specific door at the specific moment she was standing below it. She said, "You knew I'd come through the courtyard." "I knew you would come through the courtyard if you were the person I believed you to be," he said. "I've been watching you for 2 years, Lady Celine, not for them, for myself, trying to determine whether you were capable of surviving this when it came. You knew it was coming. I knew the shape of something being built. I didn't know the full architecture until 3 weeks ago, and by that point my removal was already in process." He shifted his weight. "I should have moved sooner. That is my failure, and I am carrying it." She looked at him and thought about trust. Not the general concept, but the specific right-now calculation of how much to extend to whom under conditions of severe information scarcity, which is always a different question than how much you want to trust, how much would be comforting, how much the situation seems to call for. She ran the calculation in the time it took her to breathe twice. He had removed himself from official position before tonight, which meant he had no political capital to protect. He had come to this specific location at this specific time with a lantern. He had told her Voss's name without being asked to, which was the kind of information that a double agent holds back, not leads with. And he was 70 years old and had spent half a century in this court, and was looking at her with an expression that was not the expression of someone managing her. It was the expression of someone who was tired of watching things be destroyed. "South Road," she said. "Past the estate boundary and south. How far before we're outside Voss's operational reach?" His network runs deep in the provinces for 100 miles in every direction. The border territories are thinner, 30 hours of travel on the assumption that we go now and we don't stop. You're coming. I am not useful to you dead, which is what I will be if I remain. He said it with the matter-of-fact quality of someone reporting weather conditions. I have resources staged 2 miles from the south boundary, traveling clothes, provisions, currency, and a horse bred for endurance rather than appearance. These are not recent preparations. She stared at him. 2 years, she said. As I said, I believed this was coming. She thought about what it meant. A man spending 2 years preparing an exit for a woman he had no formal obligation to, based entirely on his private assessment of a situation he could not officially acknowledge. She thought about it for exactly as long as she could afford to, which was not long. We go now, she said. Yes. She followed him. Not through the estate, not through any door that would require them to pass a guard's position or leave a record in the entry logs. Cassian moved along the interior wall of the stable block with the unhurried pace of a man who has walked this route in his head enough times that his body knows it independently of his active attention. He had a key for a door in the estate's eastern foundation wall, a door so old it predated the current security system by 60 years and appeared on no current map of the estate's access points. She did not ask him how he had the key. Some pieces of information were better understood as outcomes than as processes. The door opened on a drainage corridor that smelled of stone and winter damp, and they moved through it single file with the lantern shuttered down to its minimum, and she concentrated on the sound of her own breathing and the deliberate placement of her feet and the warmth she was generating by moving, which was the only warmth available and had to be carefully managed. The child moved once, a single rolling pressure that lasted 2 seconds and then subsided, and she held that sensation in her awareness and used it the way she had used the names earlier, as ballast, as foundation, as the thing the rest of the calculation gets built around. They emerged beyond the estate wall into a field of frozen grass at 5:22 in the morning. The sky had shifted from black to the deep specific gray that precedes dawn without yet announcing it. She could see the south road as a slightly darker line against the gray-white of the frost, and she could see the tree line 2 miles beyond it, and she began to walk toward the tree line with the same quality of motion she had used crossing the courtyard. Deliberate, efficient, without the performance of either urgency or composure, because there was no audience for this movement, and therefore no need to perform it. Cassian walked beside her and said nothing. That was, she thought, his best quality. The resources he had described were real. A small covered cart behind a screen of trees at the road's 2nd mile marker, loaded with exactly what he had listed, and the horse was a gray mare of middle age who stood in the cold without complaint and regarded them both with the level gaze of an animal that has long since made its accommodations with human unpredictability. Celine changed behind the cart, trading the ruined midnight blue silk for wool and practical boots, and she did not allow herself to think about what she was taking off except in the most logistical terms. Weight, warmth, the capacity for sustained movement. She kept the diamonds. Not sentimentality. Assessment. 3 stones of that quality, at current imperial market rates, represented approximately 14 months of living expenses for a woman of modest means, and she was going to need capital that was untraceable and portable, and she was not in a position to be delicate about the provenance of the resources available to her. Cassian drove. She sat in the cart's covered interior and let the motion of it do what motion does to a body that has been awake for 24 hours under conditions of sustained acute stress. Not sleep, she could not afford sleep yet, but a version of rest that is more about releasing the held tension than about unconsciousness. She sat with her back against the cart's sideboards and her hands in her lap, and she let the road move under her, and she thought. She thought about Lucien, not with longing, not with the particular corrosive variety of grief that would come later. She knew it would come later. She had enough self-knowledge to understand that the complete absence of grief she was currently experiencing was a function of the emergency, rather than an accurate read of her interior, and that the emergency would not last forever. She thought about him the way you think about terrain you are moving away from, systematically, with an eye toward what information it holds that might become relevant. He would wake in the morning to her absence, and he would not. Here she was honest with herself, completely honest, the luxury of total privacy. He would not search for her. He would receive the report of her escape, and he would feel, under whatever surface response was socially required, something closer to relief than to loss. Because she had become, in the course of the night's events, a complication, and Lucien's primary relationship was not with her, or with Vivienne, or with any individual person, but with the management of complication. Her disappearance resolved the complication. He would not know that she had taken the diamonds. That would register later, when the inventory was done, and it would produce in him something she could actually picture: the brief narrowing of his eyes, the slight tightening of his jaw, the quality of controlled irritation that he brought to discoveries of unexpected competence in people he had underestimated. She had seen that expression. It was one of the things she had actually honestly found interesting about him in the beginning. She shut that door. By full dawn, they were 40 miles from the estate. By noon, they had reached a town called Verret on the southern border of the province. Small, functional, the kind of place that processes people passing through without retaining memory of them, which was exactly the quality she was looking for. Cassian stopped at a trading post on the town's north road, and she went inside while he managed the horse, and she traded one of the 3 diamonds for provincial currency, clothes that did not belong to a duchess, and the name of an inn that did not ask for documentation. The innkeeper was a woman of approximately 50, with the face of someone who had been answering questions for so long that she had developed the capacity to simultaneously assess and not assess, to look directly at a person and register everything while visibly registering nothing. She looked at Celine and gave her a room on the second floor with a fire already laid, and she said, "Supper's at 6, breakfast at 7, no one asks anything of anyone in this house," and left. Celine sat on the edge of the bed and let the silence of the room settle around her. This was the first silence that was actually silent. Not the pressurized silence of the locked East Wing room, not the moving silence of the cart, but ordinary room silence, the kind that has no edges and no urgency. She sat in it and felt the full weight of the previous 18 hours descend on her body with the specific physical authority of things that have been suspended by adrenaline and are now reclaiming their due. She was exhausted in a way she had no useful vocabulary for. She was also, underneath the exhaustion, moving. Something inside her was in motion, had been in motion since the moment Cassian said Edric Voss's name, and it was not moving away from anything. It was moving toward something, though the shape of that thing was not yet fully visible. She could feel its outline the way you feel a word you cannot yet retrieve. Present, specific, not yet language. She lay down. The child moved again, twice. The ordinary percussion of a life that had no knowledge of the night it had survived. "I know," she said, to the ceiling, to the child, to herself. "I know." She slept for 4 hours. Cassian woke her at 5 with bread and a cup of something hot, and he sat in the room's single chair while she ate, and he said carefully, "There are things you need to know before we discuss where we go next." "Tell me." "Your classification," he said. "Your official magical assessment, the one on record, the one they will use to substantiate that you couldn't have cast the binding hex." She looked at him. "It's accurate as far as it goes," he said. "You genuinely cannot perform sympathetic binding work. That's real. But the classification is based on assessments conducted under standard conditions, and standard conditions don't test for the full range of what you can do." He paused. "I've been watching your magical response patterns for 2 years. What I've observed is inconsistent with a standard Class 3 rating." She set down the bread. "What have you observed?" she said. "Environmental resonance that doesn't belong to your classification. Thermal displacement in rooms you've occupied for extended periods. Twice, in the East Garden, what I would describe as anticipatory field disturbance, the kind that precedes significant power expression in high classification practitioners." He watched her face carefully. "You've been suppressing it." "Not a question." "I didn't," she started and stopped. She sat with the incomplete sentence for a moment, examining it. The truth, which she had not spoken out loud since she was 12 years old, and her father's court mage had taken her classification assessment and given her the results and suggested, very carefully, that certain results were better understood as private information in certain households. The truth was that she had never been suppressing it intentionally. She had been suppressing it the way you suppress things that have been made dangerous by context, which is to say, automatically, below the level of active decision-making, with the thoroughness of a reflex that becomes invisible through repetition. "What classification?" she said. Cassian looked at her for 3 seconds. "I believe, in full expression, you are a 7. The silence that followed was very complete. Class 7. There were 4 documented Class 7s in the Empire's recorded history. The current Imperial Court's most senior mage, a woman of 60 who had trained for 30 years and operated under constant institutional oversight, had been classified a 6 at her peak. Class 7 was the kind of number that existed more in theoretical frameworks than in practice. The classification that mage academies used as a structural ceiling for their rating systems because the alternative, having no ceiling above it, implied possibilities that institutional frameworks preferred not to examine too closely. "You've known this for 2 years," she said. "I've suspected it for 2 years. I became certain approximately 6 months ago, which is around the same time I accelerated my logistical preparations." He said it without apology. "I didn't tell you because telling you would have required telling you everything else I knew, and at that point I didn't have sufficient clarity on the full network to know whether sharing that information would help you or accelerate the timeline of their action against you." She looked at him. "That was a judgment call," he said. "I'm not asking you to agree with it." "I don't," she said, but I understand it." He nodded once. That was all. That was... She stood, went to the window and looked out at the street below. A trader loading his cart. 2 children running some small errand for someone. A dog investigating a doorstep with the methodical attention of a working professional. Ordinary town life proceeding in its ordinary way, entirely outside the architecture of everything that had happened in the last 18 hours, which was somehow both deeply strange and deeply steadying. "I need to know everything you know," she said to the window. "Not the version you curated for maximum palatability. Everything. The full network, the timeline, every name you have. I need to know the actual dimensions of what I'm dealing with." "That will take several hours." "Then we start now," he told her. He told her in the methodical way of someone who has organized information over time and knows exactly where each piece sits in relation to the others. Not a recitation, but an assembly, building the structure piece by piece so that she understood not just the facts but the relationships between them, the causal chains, the points where different lines of action had intersected and reinforced each other. It took 3 hours. She asked questions when she needed clarification and none when she didn't, and she did not interrupt the architecture of his telling to react to individual components because she had learned early that emotional response to information in real time contaminates the quality of the receiving, and she needed to receive all of this cleanly. By the time he finished, the fire had burned low, and the window had gone dark, and the town outside had settled into its evening patterns. She stood at the window for a long time. 14 months, she said finally. They were building this for 14 months before she arrived at court. At minimum. And the letter to Lucien, the one questioning the child's paternity, that was Voss's direct work, not Vivienne's. The fabrication required access to secure imperial documentation archives and the ability to replicate 3 separate authentication seals. Vivienne is capable of many things. She is not capable of that. But he used her name on it. Yes, she absorbed that, the completeness of it, the way Voss had built a structure in which Vivienne was simultaneously his instrument and his insulation, positioned to absorb consequence if the plan unraveled while he remained architecturally invisible. The sophistication of it, the years of it, the patience that required. He underestimated one thing, she said. Cassian waited. He built a plan that required Lucien to make a specific choice, she said. And the choice Lucien made was exactly what he predicted. He read Lucien correctly. She paused. He did not account for the possibility that I would survive the night. No, Cassian said. He did not. She turned from the window. Then that's the asymmetry, she said. He knows everything I am on paper. He doesn't know what I am, in fact. She looked at Cassian directly. And he doesn't know that I know his name. Something shifted in the old man's expression. Not quite a smile. Something quieter and more complicated. No, he said. He doesn't know that. She sat back down. The fire needed more wood. She added it herself, not waiting for someone to do it for her, performing the small physical task of making herself warm with her own hands. And she watched the flame take and thought about what comes next when everything you built has been taken from you, except the parts of yourself that were never anyone else's to take. What comes next, she thought, is that you find out what those parts are actually worth. I need to learn, she said, formally, systematically, everything that a Class 7 rating implies in terms of actual capability. I need to learn it in a context where no one is watching and no institutional framework is managing what I'm allowed to know about myself. She kept her eyes on the fire. How long does that take? Honestly, with your apparent natural aptitude and under proper instruction, 3 years for foundational mastery. Another 2 for the kind of operational competence that holds under genuine pressure. 5 years. More or less. She thought about 5 years. The child inside her would be 5 years old. 5 was the age at which she remembered first understanding that the world operated by rules that nobody had written down for her, that the real structure of any room was different from its stated structure, and that surviving the gap between those two things was the primary skill. 5 years old, sitting on a window seat in her father's house, watching the way the adults moved around each other, starting the long education that had brought her here. Her child would start that education in 5 years. She intended to make sure the world they started it in was a different one. Where? She said. There's a settlement in the border territories, technically outside the Empire's administrative reach, practically outside anyone's reach. A community of practitioners who have been there for 40 years. The woman who runs it was a Class 5 instructor at the Valdress Academy before she decided she was tired of institutional limitations. Cassian's voice was careful. She is not easy. She will not make accommodations for your condition or your history or the shock of the recent past. She will expect you to begin immediately and to keep up. Good, Celine said. He looked at her. I don't need someone to make accommodations, she said. I've been making accommodations for other people's comfort my entire adult life. I need someone who will tell me the truth about what I'm capable of and then make me prove it. She met his eyes. Can she do that? Yes, he said. She can absolutely do that. Then we go there. She slept that night with the practical totality of a person whose body has made a unilateral decision about what is necessary, and she woke before dawn with the same clarity she had arrived at before sleeping. No softer, no harder, just clear, the way a blade is clear when it's been correctly made. She moved through the morning's preparations with efficient economy. She ate, she packed what was necessary, she paid the innkeeper with provincial currency and received a polite nod in return, and she walked out into the gray early morning of a border town on the far edge of the Empire with her hands steady and her mind running clean and the child moving with its ordinary insistence inside her. Cassian was already at the cart. He looked at her as she approached and he said nothing because he was good at reading when silence was more useful than speech, and she climbed up beside him and they moved south in the early light. They did not speak for the first hour. Then Cassian said, "For what it's worth, and I am aware it is not worth a great deal in the current circumstances. I am sorry for the part I played in what happened last night. The part that was in action." She thought about that. The part that was in action. The 6 weeks of her frozen access to Lucian, the sealed correspondence, the managed remove from any meaningful contact with the people who might have helped her, all of it proceeding while Cassian observed and prepared his logistics and made his judgment calls about timing. "You saved my life," she said, "and my child's life. Last night in that courtyard, you saved both of us." "I should have saved you 6 weeks earlier." "Yes," she said, "you should have." He received that without deflection. She appreciated it. "But you didn't," she continued, "and I didn't save myself 6 weeks earlier, and neither of those things changes the direction we're traveling in." She looked at the road ahead, straight, frost-pale, narrowing into the tree line that marked the border territory's beginning. "What I need from you now isn't an apology. I need the name of every person in Voss's network that you haven't told me yet." A pause. "There are 3, he said. "I wasn't certain until recently, and I didn't want to—" "Tell me," he told her. She did not react. She folded each name into the existing structure of what she knew, finding its place, testing how it changed the geometry of the larger picture. One of the names surprised her, genuinely surprised her, the cold, fast movement of actual surprise moving through her chest, because it was a name she had considered an ally, had spent 2 years treating as a safe point in an unsafe room. She sat with the surprise for approximately 4 seconds, and then she let it complete and filed it with everything else. "All right," she said. "You're not," he started. "No," she said. "I'm not." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Most people, when they receive that kind of information about someone they trusted, most people haven't spent the last 12 hours recalibrating everything they thought they knew," she said. "I'm past the part where individual betrayals produce individual reactions. I'm past that now." She kept her eyes on the road. "I'm in a different part." He looked at her sidelong, this man who had spent 50 years in the courts of the powerful and had learned, over those 50 years, to read the particular qualities of people under pressure, the ones who collapse toward the pressure's center, and the ones who collapse away from it, and the rare ones, the statistically anomalous ones, who do something else entirely when the pressure arrives. He had believed she was one of the rare ones. He had staked 2 years of preparation on that belief. Looking at her now, he thought, I underestimated even that. They reached the border of the border territories at dusk, where the Imperial Road ended without ceremony. No gate, no marker, just the point where the maintained surface became unmaintained and the trees closed in on both sides with the comfortable indifference of things that do not require permission to exist. Cassian stopped the cart and consulted a paper map, and she watched the tree line and felt the shift in the air that happens at the edges of things. The particular atmospheric quality of a boundary being crossed. 2 more hours, Cassian said, if the path holds. It'll hold, she said. She didn't know how she knew that. She noted that she knew it. The path held. At full dark, on the far side of a hill that had no official name on any official map, there was light. Not a single light. A gathered light. The warm, specific light of a place where people live and have been living long enough that their fires have settled into rhythm. She could see roof lines, smoke, the movement of a person crossing between 2 buildings with a lantern. Cassian pulled the cart to a stop at the settlement's outer boundary, where a simple wooden gate stood closed. Not locked, just closed. The kind of gate that states intention rather than enforcing it. He looked at her. Once we go through, he said carefully, the story you tell here, the name you give, the history you offer, that's your decision. I'll follow whatever you decide. She looked at the gate, at the lights beyond it, at the roof lines of a place that existed outside the architecture of everything that had destroyed her, outside Voss's network and Lucien's court, and the 14 months of careful construction that had been aimed at her elimination, outside the world that had named her and classified her and contained her, and finally, tried to destroy her. She thought about what name she wanted in a place like this. She thought about the child who would be born here, whose first name would be spoken here, in this firelight, by people who had never heard of the Ravenscar Duchy, or the Winter Banquet, or the marble floor and the 600 candles. She thought about what she was now, in the most accurate possible terms. Not the Duchess, not the wife, not the Class 3 practitioner of limited sympathetic ability, not any of the documented, classified, managed, contained versions of herself that had been built for other people's use. My name is Celine, she said. Just that. No house name, no husband's name, no title. Cassian nodded. She got down from the cart and walked to the gate and opened it herself. And she walked through into the firelight of a place that did not know her yet, carrying everything she was and everything that had been done to her and the child who would be born in 4 months and the 5 years ahead of her that she intended to use with a quality of purpose and precision that she had never been permitted to apply to anything before. Behind her, the gate swung shut. She did not look back. Ahead of her, crossing the settlement's central path with a lantern and the unhurried gait of someone entirely at home in the dark, a woman stopped. She was perhaps 60, with close-cropped gray hair and the physical bearing of someone who has spent decades doing physically demanding work and has never once been apologetic about it. She looked at Celine with a direct assessment that lasted approximately 3 seconds. Not unkind, not particularly warm, just accurate. The look of someone determining what they are working with. Cassian wrote, the woman said. Her voice was flat and direct. American prairie plain. He said you'd be trouble. He's right, Celine said. The woman looked at her for 1 more second. Then something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but a recognition of something that satisfied an internal criterion. Good, she said. We've got too many people here who aren't. Follow me. She turned and walked toward the firelight, and Celine followed her. And in that moment, in the simple physical act of following a woman toward a fire she had not known existed 24 hours ago, she felt the full force of what she was walking into. Not safety. Safety was not on offer here, and she was not looking for it. What was on offer was something harder and more durable. The chance to become, deliberately and without apology, the complete version of what she had always actually been. 5 years. The Empire still out there, Voss still building, Lucien still standing in the ruins of a decision he didn't fully understand yet. 5 years. She would be ready before then. She had taken 3 steps inside the settlement when she heard it, behind her, back at the gate, a sound that should not have been possible. A sound that meant someone had followed them across 30 miles of border territory in the dark, on a path that appeared on no official map, and had done it without being seen or heard until this exact moment. She turned. At the gate, barely visible in the firelight's outer reach, a man stood with his hand on the wood and his breathing hard from effort, and his eyes finding her in the dark with the specific quality of someone who has been moving toward a single fixed point for a very long time. She did not recognize the face, but she recognized the uniform. It was the private uniform of House Ravenscar, not the livery of a public guard, but the private seal worn by the Duke's personal intelligence staff, the men who moved in directions that never appeared in official reports. And its presence here, at this gate, on this night, meant something that her mind was already processing before the recognition was complete. Lucian had sent someone, not to retrieve her. She understood with immediate certainty that it was not retrieval. The posture was wrong. The single operative, rather than a team, was wrong. The exhaustion in the man's body that spoke of genuine personal urgency rather than professional execution was wrong for retrieval. He had sent someone to warn her. About what? She did not yet know. But the fact that within 12 hours of her escape, Lucien had dispatched someone to find her across 30 miles of unmarked territory with whatever information required this kind of urgency, meant that something had broken in the architecture of the night's events. Something had cracked open and shown him a piece of the truth, and the piece was bad enough that he had sent a man running after her in the dark. She stood in the firelight of her new life, 5 steps inside the gate she had just closed behind her, and she looked at the man who had come through it. She looked at him for a long time. Then she walked back to the gate. His name was Dorian Fell. She learned that in the first 30 seconds, before anything else, because names are the first instrument of assessment, and she had learned to collect them before impressions, before posture reading, before any of the other evaluative machinery she ran on strangers. He gave it without being asked, blurted it almost, in the specific way of someone whose operational training has been partially overridden by the physical urgency of what they've just done, which was run 30 miles in the dark to reach a gate that appeared on no official map. He was perhaps 25, lean in the way of someone who moves for a living rather than for fitness. The Ravenscar private seal on his chest was exactly what she had identified from across the yard, small, precisely placed at the left breast, the kind of detail that spoke of careful institutional pride rather than casual affiliation. His hands were steady despite the hard breathing. That was notable. "You need to come with me," he said. "No," she said. "I need you to tell me what you know. Here. Now." He looked past her at Cassian, who had come to stand slightly behind her left shoulder with the lantern, and then at the settlement beyond, the firelight and roof lines of a place that was visibly outside every institutional framework he had been trained to operate within. She watched him recalibrate, watched the professional assessment run its quick cycle, and arrive at the conclusion that the ground rules here were different from any ground rules he had prepared for. Good. Let him be off balance. Off balance people tell you more. "Lord Voss moved tonight," Dorian said. He kept his voice low, which told her he'd assessed the settlement's proximity correctly. "Inside the estate. After the situation was resolved, he came to the Duke with a secondary proposal. His people framed it as a legal clarification of the succession question, but what it actually was, he moved to have the child declared non-legitimate before the birth," she said. Dorian's mouth closed briefly. He had not expected her to complete that sentence. "Yes." "Which, under imperial inheritance law, would require documentation filed with the imperial court within 72 hours of the initial accusation," she continued. "Which means the clock started last night at the banquet. Which means he has approximately 54 hours remaining to file before the legal window closes." A beat of silence. "How do you know imperial succession law?" he said. "I read a great deal when people assume I am decorating a room." She looked at him directly. "Keep going." He kept going. What he told her took 11 minutes, standing at the gate in the cold with Cassian's lantern throwing their shadows long across the frozen ground. The structure of it was consistent with everything Cassian had already given her. It confirmed rather than revised, which was either reassuring or a sign that Dorian's intelligence had been carefully curated before being handed to him, and she filed both possibilities with equal weight. The additional information was specific and operational. Voss had arrived at the estate with 2 imperial court representatives, which meant he had pre-positioned legal infrastructure before the banquet, which meant the banquet itself was not the plan's initiation, but its conclusion. The whole apparatus had been staged and ready. The banquet was simply the night they pulled the trigger. One piece was new. The Duke, she said, interrupting. You said he came to the Duke with a secondary proposal. What was Lucien's response? Dorian's eyes shifted slightly. Not away. He was too trained for the obvious tells, but a micro-movement at the corner of his left eye that spoke of something he was deciding how to deliver. He agreed to receive the proposal, Dorian said carefully. That's not what I asked. He agreed to review the documentation. Dorian, she said his name with the flat precision of someone who has no interest in the performance of patience. What did Lucien do? The young man's jaw tightened slightly. He dismissed his private staff from the room, all except Voss's 2 representatives, and then he asked for a pen. She heard it. She heard it the way you hear a door close in a house you thought you knew. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the clean terminal sound of a mechanism completing its function. She stood with it for 3 full seconds, feeling it do what it needed to do, moving through her with its full weight rather than trying to manage it into something smaller. He had agreed to the documentation. She had told herself, in the East Wing room, in the cart, on the road, that she had already recalibrated around the full reality of what Lucien had done and was capable of doing. She had believed that was true. She was discovering, standing here in the dark 30 miles from everything she had known, that there are levels of calibration and that the level she had reached was not the bottom. Lucien had agreed to declare their child illegitimate before it was born. In writing, "All right," she said. Her voice was the same. She noticed that it was the same. No crack this time, no stress fracture. Something had already moved beyond the register where voice cracks. That's not all, Dorian said. She looked at him. The documentation Voss brought, the secondary filing, it included a provision, a legal provision for the management of the former Duchess in the event of her apprehension. He stopped. Say the word, she said. He said it. Elimination. The lantern flame moved in a brief crosswind and steadied. Signed, she said. Reviewed and countersigned. Yes. She looked at Cassian. His face in the lantern light was very still, the specific stillness of a man who has been in this world long enough that the worst news no longer produces visible shock, but still produces something, a deep interior compression visible only in the quality of his stillness. Why are you here? She said, turning back to Dorian. Flat, direct, the question beneath the question. You're his private intelligence staff. He signed a document authorizing my elimination. You should be on the other side of this gate doing the job, not standing here warning me. Dorian looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not fully categorize. Not guilt. Guilt implies a debt to the person being apologized to, and they owed each other nothing. Something more complicated, something that had a personal dimension she had not yet mapped. He doesn't know I'm here, Dorian said. He thinks I'm in the field on the Voss secondary briefing. I have approximately 6 hours before my absence becomes a liability. That doesn't answer my question. My mother was a practitioner, he said. Class 2. She was condemned on a fabricated charge when I was 11. She did not survive the investigation. He kept his eyes level on hers. I am very good at my job. I am also very good at knowing when my employer is being used to repeat a pattern that I have personal reasons to find unacceptable. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, What do you want in return? He blinked. He had not expected that to be the next sentence. Most people, she thought, would have said something about gratitude or trust or the importance of what he'd just disclosed. She had asked him what he wanted, because everything costs something, and pretending it doesn't is how you end up with debts you didn't know you were accruing. Nothing tonight, he said. Eventually, when whatever you're building here is built, I want a place in it. I don't know yet what I'm building. I know, he said. I'm betting on the shape of it anyway. She held that, tested it, filed it under unresolved but not hostile. Go back, she said. Do your job. Don't compromise your position for me again until I ask you to, if I ask you to. And if Voss moves before you're ready, then Voss moves, she said, and we adjust. He looked at her for one more second. Then he nodded, once, and turned, and within 30 feet the dark had swallowed him completely. Not dramatically, not cinematically, just the simple, unremarkable return of a man to the darkness he operated in. She watched the space where he had been for a moment. Then she turned back to Cassian. He was looking at her with the expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of concern, careful, analytical concern, The kind that doesn't offer comfort because it understands comfort is not what's being requested. 72 hours, he said. More like 52 now. And if the filing goes through, then the child has no legal standing in the Ravenscar succession. The inheritance line passes to whatever child Vivienne produces, and I become a woman who can be legally eliminated as a threat to imperial succession stability. She said it all at the same pace, the way you recite the terms of a problem before beginning to solve it, which means the filing cannot go through. He was very still. You cannot stop it from here. Not from here, no. She looked past him at the settlement, at the firelight that had seemed 20 minutes ago like the beginning of 5 years of controlled preparation. The woman with the close-cropped gray hair had waited just inside the boundary, giving them the gate conversation's privacy, and was still waiting now with the patient quality of someone who has learned that most crises resolve into one of 4 or 5 structural types, and all of them eventually require the same response: assessment, decision, movement. Celine walked to her. The woman, she had not yet given her name, and Celine had not yet asked, looked at her with the same direct 3-second assessment she had offered at their first meeting, and this time let it run a second longer. Change of timeline, Celine said. I heard enough, the woman said. How far along are you? 20 weeks? Can you travel hard? I just traveled 30 miles in the back of a cart in winter, yes. The corner of the woman's mouth moved again. The same, not quite smile. What do you need from me? I need to know what I can actually do, Celine said, not what the classification says. What I can actually do, right now, tonight, with no preparation and no institutional framework telling me what's appropriate. I need to know that before I decide what the next move is. The woman looked at her for a moment. Then she said, Follow me, and walked deeper into the settlement without looking back to see if Celine was following. She was following. The woman led her to a building at the settlement's eastern edge, smaller than the others, set apart. The kind of structural separation that speaks of deliberate purpose rather than accident. Inside, the room was bare except for a stone floor and a single lamp and a circle drawn on the floor in what appeared to be compressed mineral pigment, 6 feet across, its edges precise in the way that spoke of repeated use rather than recent construction. The woman stood outside the circle and looked at Celine with an expression that was entirely professional. Stand in it, she said. Celine stood in it. Close your eyes. She closed them. Tell me what you feel. What she felt, standing in that circle on that floor in that bare room, was the thing she had been suppressing for 19 years. She had suppressed it so completely, for so long, with such thorough automatic efficiency, that she had almost convinced herself it wasn't there, that Cassian was wrong, that whatever he'd observed in the East Garden and the rooms she'd occupied was ambient noise rather than signal. Standing in the circle with her eyes closed, she felt it the way you feel something that has been pressed flat, suddenly allowed to expand. Not gently, not gradually, but with the immediate wholeness of a thing returning to its actual dimensions. It was enormous. She opened her eyes. The woman across the circle from her had gone very still. The lamp flame was doing something it had not been doing before Celine stepped into the circle, bending, very slightly, toward her, as if she had become, in the simple act of stopping her suppression, a low-grade atmospheric event. 7, the woman said, not a question. That's what Cassian believes. Cassian is conservative by nature. The woman's voice was carefully neutral, the voice of someone running rapid internal recalibration. Step out of the circle. Celine stepped out. The lamp flame straightened. What's your operational window before you need to be somewhere? The woman said. 50 hours. Approximately. What's the objective? Stop illegal filing at the imperial court. The woman was quiet for 6 seconds. Celine counted because counting gave her something to do with the part of her mind that was not standing in the fire of what she had just felt. That enormous, patient, entirely undeveloped thing that had been living inside her for 19 years and waiting with a quality of patience she could not quite compass. In 50 hours, the woman said, I cannot teach you anything useful. I know. What I can do... She stopped. Started again with the careful quality of someone choosing words for their precision rather than their comfort. What I can do is help you stop suppressing it. That's not training. That's just removal of the internal obstruction. What happens after that is not something I can fully predict or control because a 7 who has been suppressed for 19 years and then released is not something I have direct experience with. Are you clear on that? I'm clear. You could hurt people. I could be eliminated by an imperial court order within 50 hours, Celine said, along with my child. I am clear on the risk calculus. The woman looked at her for a long moment in the lamplight. Your name, the woman said. Your actual name. Celine. I'm Mira, the woman said. And then she said, sit down on the floor. And she sat across from her. And the real work began. What happened in that room over the next 4 hours was not dramatic in the way that Celine had been unconsciously bracing for. Not the pyrotechnic rupture of a dam breaking. Not the sudden violent expression of 19 years of compressed potential. It was slower and stranger than that, more like surgery than explosion. Mira's hands and voice moving through careful, precise work. Finding the places where suppression had become structure and dismantling those structures with the deliberate attention of someone who understands that the goal is not destruction, but reconfiguration. She felt it happening in layers. The outermost layer was the social suppression, the automatic flattening response she had developed in her father's house at 11 or 12, the one that kicked in whenever she felt the ambient potential in a room and sent it back down before it could register on anyone's instruments. That layer came apart relatively quickly, and she felt its absence as a kind of weightlessness, a strange lightening that was not comfortable exactly but was clarifying. The deeper layers were harder. There was one, somewhere in her mid-adolescence, that she associated physically with a specific memory. A room in her father's house. A conversation she had overheard, the moment she had understood that what she was needed to be made smaller if she was going to survive the people who surrounded it. She had done that. She had made it smaller with the thoroughness of someone who understands that the job needs to be done completely or not at all. And the thoroughness had worked so well that she had forgotten she'd done it. Mira found that layer at approximately the second hour and looked at Celine across the room with an expression that was not pity and was not admiration. Something between them. Something that had more weight than either. You did this to yourself, Mira said. Deliberately. Yes. At what age? 14. A silence. That's not suppression. That's construction. You built a wall inside yourself, and then you lived inside it for 5 years, and then you married someone and moved into a new building, and you never went back for it. No. Why? Celine looked at the floor between them. The bare stone of it, gray-brown in the lamplight, ordinary and specific and real. Because by the time I understood what I'd built, I understood also that dismantling it alone would be, I didn't know what it would be. And I didn't have anyone I trusted to help me find out. Mira was quiet for a moment. You have someone now. I appear to, Celine said. The third hour was the hardest. She would not, afterward, describe it to anyone in detail, partly because the detail was not easily languaged, and partly because it was hers. The specific private interior event of a woman dismantling the architecture of her own containment and feeling underneath it the thing she had contained. It was not violent. It was not peaceful. It was the exact sensation of becoming, in real time, larger than you have been allowed to be, which is one of the most disorienting experiences available to a human body. She cried once, briefly, not from grief, from the simple physiological response to an internal pressure gradient resolving, the way eyes water in strong wind. Mira handed her water and said nothing. By the fourth hour, she was sitting in the lamplight feeling the full dimensions of something she had no name for yet. Something that ran through her like a second circulatory system she hadn't known she had. And Mira was watching her with the carefully maintained neutral expression of a professional who has witnessed unexpected things and is choosing, for now, to observe rather than interpret. Can you manage it? Mira said. I don't know yet. Can you keep from burning down my settlement? Celine looked at the lamp, looked at the flame. Thought about the lamp with the same quality of attention she brought to anything she needed to understand, and she felt the flame respond to that attention. Not dramatically, just a slight directional lean, a tropism, something acknowledging something. Yes, she said. Then you can travel. Mira stood. You leave in 2 hours, sleep in the interval. Your body needs it whether you think it does or not, and a 7 operating on exhaustion is a liability to herself and everyone in her vicinity. Celine slept. 2 hours, flat and total, on a bedroll in the corner of the room, And when she woke, the settlement was in the deep quiet of late night, and the lamp had burned low, and Cassian was sitting against the opposite wall with his own eyes closed and his breathing even and slow. She lay still for a moment and took inventory of herself the way she had been taking inventory since the East Wing room. Methodical, clinical, starting with the physical and moving inward. Physical. Tired but functional. The child. Present, moving, the ordinary percussion continuing undisturbed, which she noted with the specific quality of gratitude she allowed herself and then moved past. Interior, different. The difference was not dramatic from the outside, she suspected, but from the inside it was the difference between a room with one small window and a room with a wall removed. She could feel the estate from here. Not specifically, not Lucien's heartbeat or Vivian's scheming or the particular temperature of the room where Voss's representatives had laid their documentation on a desk. But she could feel the empire the way you feel weather when you have lived under the same sky long enough. Its weight, its pressure systems, the particular atmospheric quality of concentrated power, and the people who gathered around it. She could feel Voss, not his physical location. Something harder to name than that. The shape of what he had built, the patience of it, the years of careful architectural work, the satisfaction of a man who had designed a machine and watched it perform exactly as designed. She could feel the machine, and she could feel, in the particular way that her newly undismantled self seemed to process information, where the machine was weakest. She sat up. Cassian opened his eyes. He had not been sleeping. "I can feel it," she said. He looked at her carefully. "What specifically?" "Where Voss is vulnerable. In the filing, there's a vulnerability in the filing process that I couldn't have identified yesterday, but I can identify now." She was not certain how she knew this. She was not certain that certainty was the right framework for what she was doing. She was operating on something that felt less like reasoning and more like the body's knowledge of its own balance. Pre-rational, positional, accurate. The documentation requires authentication by 2 imperial court seals. Voss has one. He's acquiring the second from a representative who wasn't at the estate tonight, someone he needs to reach before the window closes. Cassian was very still. "How do you—" "I don't know how," she said. "It doesn't matter how. What matters is that if the second seal's acquisition is disrupted, the filing cannot be completed within the legal window. The window closes. We buy time." "Buy time for what?" "For what Mira started tonight. I need more time with her. Real time, sustained work. What she opened tonight is the beginning of something that needs 6 months of proper development before it can be reliably operational." She stood. "But one disruption doesn't require full operational reliability. It requires one precise intervention at exactly the right point." Cassian stood too. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not the familiar careful assessment, not the analytical concern. Something older. Something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, like a man watching something he had believed in theoretically for 2 years become concrete in front of him. "Celine," he said. He rarely used her first name. "Don't," she said, not unkindly. "I know what you're going to say, and I know why you're going to say it, and we don't have time for it." He closed his mouth. "Where would the second seal representative be?" she said. "If Voss's network runs south and the estate is north, and he needs someone not connected to last night's operation, where would Voss be sending a courier tonight?" Cassian thought for 3 seconds. "Alden Mere, provincial administrative seat, 40 miles east. There's a magistrate there who has been in Voss's network for 6 years, documented. I have the documentation. He holds dual imperial court authentication privileges. Can we reach Aldenmere before a Voss courier? If we left in the next 20 minutes, on the assumption that Voss dispatched the courier after the estate meeting within the last 3 hours, we might be 2 to 4 hours ahead of them. Then we're leaving in 20 minutes, she said. Mira was waiting at the settlement's boundary when they brought the cart around. The gray mare stood in the cold with her characteristic equanimity, and Mira stood beside the gate with her arms folded and her face in the dark, expressing something that was not quite approval and was not quite warning, but contained elements of both. "You're not ready for this," Mira said. "I know. A Class 7 in the first hour's post-suppression release is unpredictable at levels that—" "I know," Celine said again. She looked at Mira directly. "I am not ready. I am also the only option available. And my child does not have the luxury of waiting for me to be ready." She held the older woman's gaze. "I will come back. When this is done, I will come back here, and I will do the 5 years of work. But right now, I need to go. Mira looked at her for a long moment. The night was very quiet. Somewhere in the settlement, a fire cracked and resettled. If you lose control of it, Mira said, do you know how to shut it back down? No. Then don't lose control of it. She stepped back from the gate. Go. They went. 40 miles of winter road in the dark, the gray mare moving with her efficient, unhurried stride, the cart's rhythm, the only constant in 2 hours of motion that Celine spent in a state of focused inward attention that was nothing like the composed suppression of the previous 19 years. She was not suppressing now. She was holding a different thing, the difference between a closed fist and an open hand shaped around something fragile. And the distinction required constant active awareness that was exhausting in a way she had no previous reference point for. Cassian drove and said nothing. She was grateful for that. Aldenmere materialized out of the dark around the 40-mile mark, larger than Verret, a proper provincial seat with a main road and administrative buildings and the particular density of a place that has existed long enough to have accumulated layers of purpose. They came in from the western approach at 3 in the morning, when the town was as quiet as it got, which was not entirely quiet. A provincial administrative seat has night workers, couriers, people whose business does not acknowledge the hour. The magistrate's office was on the main road, identifiable by the imperial seal above the door and the lamp burning in the ground floor window, which indicated either a night clerk or someone working late, or both. Celine got down from the cart. You need to wait here, she said to Cassian. He started to object and she held up one hand, not dramatically, just the flat gesture of someone who has made a decision and is indicating that the decision is not a discussion. He waited. She crossed the road to the magistrate's office and pushed open the door. The man inside was not a night clerk. He was perhaps 55, with the specific physical quality of a man who has spent 3 decades in administrative work, slightly thickened through the middle, precise in his movements, with the habitual, alert watchfulness of someone who processes people across a desk for a living and has learned to assess them quickly. He looked up from his papers when she entered and gave her the look. The woman alone at 3 in the morning look, the rapid triage of category and response. She gave him no time to complete the triage. Magistrate Holt, she said. She had gotten the name from Cassian on the road. My name is Celine Ravenscar. I am the Duchess of House Ravenscar. I am here to inform you that the documentation you are scheduled to authenticate within the next several hours has been obtained through the use of fabricated imperial records, directed by Lord Edric Voss, using illegal sympathetic binding magic provided by Vivienne Castrel. The authentication you provide will make you party to a succession fraud currently being investigated by the Imperial Intelligence Service. She was not certain whether the Imperial Intelligence Service was in fact investigating. It was, at this moment, an operational statement rather than a factual one. Holt stared at her. His face did what faces do when they receive information that requires rapid internal restructuring. A very brief, very complete blankness. The expression of a system rebooting. Then the restructuring completed, and she watched him arrive at a position that was neither belief nor disbelief, but something more dangerous. Calculation. I don't know what you're referring to, he said. You do, she said. And you know what the penalty for succession fraud carries under imperial law. You also know that Lord Voss has been managing your exposure for 6 years, which means he is the only person currently standing between you and that penalty, which means your loyalty to him tonight is not optional from your perspective. She sat down across from him without being invited to. She kept her hands flat on the desk, palms down, fingers relaxed. She was holding the thing inside her the way Mira had shown her, present, shaped, contained by active attention rather than suppression. She could feel Holt's fear of her across the desk like a temperature differential, and she did not use it, did not press against it, just held it in her awareness as information. I am not here to destroy you, she said. I am here to give you a choice you would not otherwise have. If you authenticate that documentation, you become an integral component of a succession fraud that will, when it unravels, and it will unravel, take every person connected to it down with it. If you do not authenticate it, if you report that the courier who arrives here in the next few hours was turned away for procedural irregularities in the documentation, you are simply a magistrate who followed proper protocol. That's the choice. Holt was looking at her with the expression of a man who is rapidly and somewhat desperately trying to determine who has more power in this room. She let him look. He made his calculation. She watched it happen behind his eyes, the assessment of which risk was larger, which outcome was more survivable, which choice left him more intact. She did not rush it. She understood that rushing it would produce resistance, and that giving it time would produce, eventually, the conclusion that a man of Holt's caliber would inevitably reach when given sufficient quiet to think clearly. "What documentation are you referring to specifically?" he said finally. His voice had changed. Still careful, but the calculation was pointing somewhere. "You will know it when it arrives," she said, "because it will carry Voss's private seal in the secondary authentication position, and it will request your imperial court mark as the primary certification." She paused. "When that happens, you will find a procedural irregularity. You will not need to specify what the irregularity is. Procedural irregularity is sufficient." He was quiet for a long moment. "If Voss finds out," he started. "He will find out," she said, "and when he does, you will be a man who turned away a courier for procedural reasons, and he will have no ability to prove otherwise, and more urgently, he will have other larger problems occupying his attention." She stood. "I am telling you this for the last time. When the courier comes, there is a procedural irregularity." She walked to the door, stopped with her hand on the frame, and did not turn around. "You have children, Magistrate, 2 daughters. I know their ages because I know a great deal about the composition of Voss's provincial network." She let that sit for 2 seconds. "I do not say this as a threat. I say it because a man with daughters understands something about what it costs when institutional power is pointed at a woman who has committed no crime except existing in inconvenient proximity to something someone else wants. You understand that. Act accordingly." She walked out. The cold hit her as she crossed the road back to the cart, and she stood beside it for a moment, breathing the cold air and feeling the thing inside her still held, still shaped, still hers. Her hands were not shaking. She noted that they were not shaking. Cassian looked at her. "Well, he'll turn the courier away," she said. "You're certain?" "I'm certain enough to act on it." He looked at her for a moment with the old familiar analytical attention. "You were in there for 6 minutes." "Yes." "What did you—" He stopped, started differently. "What happened in there?" She thought about how to describe it. The desk, the lamp, the particular quality of presence she had brought to that room that was different from any quality she had brought to any room before, because the room she had been bringing to every room for 19 years had a wall in it, and the wall was gone. And the full dimensions of what she was had been present in that office in a way that Magistrate Holt had felt, she was certain, the way you feel weather, not as threat, not as performance, just as atmospheric fact. "I told him the truth," she said, "with everything I had." Cassian absorbed that. Then he clicked to the gray mare, and they moved. They were 2 miles from Aldenmuir's western boundary when it happened. She felt it first. A sudden pressure change in the air around the cart. Not weather, not natural. The specific signature of directed magical work coming from multiple points simultaneously, and she said stop a full second before the first figure stepped onto the road ahead. 3 of them. The road behind revealed 2 more when she turned, 5 total. In the plain clothing of travelers, but their positioning was not the positioning of travelers. It was the positioning of people who have been taught to manage an extraction efficiently, who know where the optimal standing points are relative to a vehicle on a narrow road, who have done this before. Not Voss's personal people. The quality was wrong. These were contracted. The specific, slightly mismatched quality of a team assembled for a single job rather than trained together over time. The one in front spoke. "The woman. She comes with us." Cassian's hands tightened on the reins. She was very still. She thought about what Mira had said. Don't lose control of it. She thought about the 4 hours of careful architectural work, the thing that was open in her now, the thing she was holding with active attention. She thought about 5 figures in a road at 3 in the morning who knew her name and her location and had been waiting here, which meant Dorian's 6-hour window had been shorter than he'd calculated, which meant Voss knew she had run, which meant the operational timeline she had been working from was already obsolete. She thought about her child. The man in front had not finished speaking. He was saying something about the Duke's authority and the documentation and the legal mandate, and she heard the words the way you hear background noise when the foreground has your complete attention, present, registered, assigned their appropriate weight. The appropriate weight was very low. She got down from the cart. Cassian said her name, low and urgent, and she did not respond to it, not because she was ignoring him, but because she was in the particular state of focus that has no bandwidth for peripheral input. She stepped into the road between the cart and the man in front, and she looked at him with the full and complete and unwalled attention of the thing she had always been and had been told to make smaller. The man stopped talking. He felt it. The one behind him felt it. She watched it move through all 5 of them simultaneously. That temperature differential, that atmospheric fact of a presence they had not been briefed on, had no category for, had no response trained into their bodies to answer. "You're going to let us pass," she said. Her voice was very quiet. It was not the voice of a threat. It was the voice of someone conveying accurate information. The man in front looked at her. His face was doing something complicated. "I have a direct mandate from—" The lamp on the cart went out. All 5 of them looked at it. It had not been blown out. There was no wind. It had simply, between one breath and the next, stopped burning. And in the darkness that followed, the only illumination was the cold moonlight and the faint atmospheric shimmer that she was becoming aware, with some surprise, was coming from her. Not visible to ordinary eyes, probably, but apparently visible to the body's threat-sensing apparatus, because every figure in the road had taken one step back without appearing to decide to. She had not done that intentionally. That was the part that frightened her, not the magnitude of it, not what it had done to the lamp or the air around the cart, or the breathing pattern of 5 contracted men on a provincial road at 3 in the morning. The fact that she had not decided to do it, that it had happened because she had stopped managing her own dimensions, had stopped making herself smaller, and what she actually was had responded to a threat the way a body responds to a threat, below the level of decision, at the level of reflex. Mira had said, "Don't lose control of it." She had not lost control. But she understood, standing in that road, feeling the full scope of what she was holding and what it was capable of even in these early undeveloped hours, that the line between control and its absence was narrower than she had thought. And the understanding settled over her not as fear, but as the specific gravity of a woman who has just learned something irrevocable about herself. She could not go back to being smaller. She would never be smaller again. The man in front of her looked at her for 3 more seconds. Then he stepped aside. She walked back to the cart and got in, and Cassian started the mare moving, and she did not look at any of the 5 figures as they passed them, and nobody spoke. And behind them the road was very quiet. At the first mile past Aldenmuir's boundary, Cassian said, in a voice that was almost steady, "What was that?" "The beginning," she said. She did not mean it as a comfort. She meant it as a fact. And sitting in the cold of the moving cart with the child moving inside her and the vast, undeveloped potential of herself open for the first time in 19 years, and the empire ahead of her and Voss's timeline still running, and Lucian's signature drying on a document she intended to make meaningless, she understood that the woman she had been in that marble hall, composed and managed and smaller than her own dimensions, was gone. What replaced her had not yet found its name. But the empire was going to learn it. She looked at the road ahead, and she did not allow herself anything that resembled comfort, because comfort was what you reached for when you were finished, and she was so far from finished that the distance was not yet measurable. What she allowed herself instead was the cold, clean, completely unfamiliar sensation of a woman who has stopped asking for permission, not because she stopped needing things, not because she stopped being afraid, but because she finally understood that the permission was never coming, and she had run out of time to wait for it. The filing window closed at dawn on the 3rd day. She knew the exact hour because Cassian had calculated it from imperial succession law with the precision of a man who understood that when the margin between survival and ruin is measured in minutes, approximation is a luxury you cannot afford. Dawn on the 3rd day meant first light, which in midwinter at this latitude meant approximately 6:47 in the morning, and they had spent the 30 hours since leaving Aldenmuir in the kind of sustained forward motion that leaves no space for anything except the next necessary thing. Holt had turned the courier away. She had known he would. What she had not known, what nobody had known, because it required understanding a dimension of Voss's operational planning that even Cassian had not fully mapped, was that the courier was a contingency. Voss had not sent one seal-bearer. He had sent 3 to 3 different magistrates on 3 different roads, because a man who had spent 20 years building an empire of influence within an empire of power had learned that redundancy is not paranoia, but arithmetic. Dorian found them at dawn on the 2nd day, on the road that had no name between the border territories and the provincial capital. He looked like he had not slept. He looked like sleep had not been an available option since he left the settlement gate 2 days earlier, and the quality of his exhaustion was the specific quality of someone running on something purer and more corrosive than adrenaline. The fuel of a man who is committed to a direction and is burning everything he has to maintain the speed it requires. He told them about the 3 couriers in approximately 90 seconds. She listened without interrupting. Then she said, "Where are the other 2? One is already turned back. A magistrate named Ferris in the North Provincial Circuit, who apparently has his own unresolved grievances with Voss and needed no persuasion. The 3rd," he stopped, breathed. "The 3rd is already at the capital." The capital. She sat with that for exactly 2 seconds. How long ago? 6 hours, maybe 7. 6 hours ahead of them, on the road to the imperial capital, a courier was carrying documentation that would, when authenticated by the right seal bearer inside the capital's administrative quarter, finalize the legal elimination of her child's existence as a Ravenscar heir. The capital was 9 hours from their current position under optimal conditions. Optimal conditions in midwinter on provincial roads, with a pregnant woman and a tired horse and an old man, did not describe the conditions available to them. They were 3 hours behind a problem that had already arrived. She looked at the road ahead. She felt the thing inside her. Not reaching for it, just acknowledging its presence. The way you acknowledge the weight of a tool in your hand when you understand you are about to need it. "There's another way to stop it," she said. Both men looked at her. "The filing doesn't just require authentication," she said. "It requires the Duke's original signature to be validated by a specific imperial court process. A process that allows for challenge within the window if the challenging party can demonstrate standing." She was running through the succession law architecture she had spent 2 years reading in the Ravenscar library during the long hours when Lucien had no use for her company. She had not known then why she was reading it. The body knows what it needs before the mind has framed the question. If I appear before the imperial court before the authentication completes, and assert my standing as the child's mother under the pre-reformed succession statutes. "Those statutes haven't been invoked in 40 years, Cassian said. "They haven't been repealed either." He was quiet for a moment, running his own legal architecture. She watched him find the same structure she had found and arrive at the same conclusion. "It would require you to appear in the imperial capital," he said carefully, "in person, before the court. Yes, as the woman who was officially accused of practicing forbidden magic against a noble's person, who escaped imperial custody, who is currently traveling under no official identity. Yes. With no documentation, no legal representation, no allied presence in the capital, and no certainty that the court will grant you the floor before the authentication is complete. Also, yes." Dorian was looking at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of the expression Cassian had worn at the settlement gate. The expression of a man watching something that exceeds the parameters he had mentally prepared for. "You're going to walk into the imperial court," Dorian said, "alone." "Not alone," she said. She looked at Cassian. "But he stays outside." Cassian's jaw tightened. "You are 70 years old and you have done enough," she said. Not gently. She did not have the bandwidth for gentle right now, but with the specific weight of a true statement delivered without padding. "If this goes wrong, you need to not be in that building. You need to be in a position to take the child somewhere safe." The child. She said it without breaking stride, without the slight catch she had been managing since the East Wing room every time the word appeared in her interior monologue, where only she could hear it. She said it the way she said everything now, directly, with its full weight, without the suppression that had been her primary operating mode for 19 years and was no longer available. Cassian looked at her for a long time. His face was doing the thing it did when he was calculating against his own resistance. The small interior struggle between the professional assessment that said one thing and the instinct that said another. The 2-second battle between what was strategically sound and what he wanted to do instead. "If you're not out in 2 hours," he said, "then make decisions based on the information available to you," she said. "Don't wait." He did not like it. She could see that he did not like it in every line of his body. But he was, at his core, a man who had spent 50 years learning to act on assessments rather than preferences, and his assessment was the same as hers. She turned to Dorian. "You're coming in with me." He nodded immediately. No hesitation. She noted the no hesitation and filed it. They reached the capital at the 9th-hour mark, arriving from the Western Road as the city was moving through its mid-morning rhythms, the specific dense energy of a place where 10,000 simultaneous purposes intersect without coordination. She had been to the imperial capital twice in her life, once as a child, once in the first months of her marriage. It was the kind of city that reorganized your sense of scale every time you encountered it, the sheer compression of its density pressing against the eye with something that was not quite beauty and not quite threat, but contained both. She had changed in the back of the moving cart. Practical clothes, her own dark hair unornamented, the remaining diamonds removed and placed in the inner pocket of Cassian's coat, because what she needed in that building today was not wealth display, but the particular quality of presence that does not ask for things and does not apologize for existing. And the diamonds were the wrong signal for both. She looked, she thought, like a woman of no particular status. She felt like a weather system. The Imperial Court's administrative building was on the capital's northern quarter, identifiable from 3 streets away by the imperial seal above its entrance and the permanent presence of court guards at the main doors, 2 at the entrance, 1 at the side passage. The geometry of it designed to move ordinary business through the side passage and reserve the main entrance for authorized court proceedings. She walked in through the main entrance. The guards moved to intercept her, and she did not stop walking. She did not increase her pace. She simply continued moving at the pace she had established. And she said, without looking directly at either of them, but projecting her voice with the flat authority of someone who has been managing rooms for 19 years and knows exactly how much volume is required to establish who is in charge of an entrance. I am Celine Ravenscar, Duchess of House Ravenscar, invoking pre-reformed succession statute 14 regarding challenge standing in a contested heir documentation. I require immediate floor access to the court clerk. The guard stopped. It was a beat. Just a beat. The 2-second pause of trained professionals encountering an input their training had not specifically prepared them for. And in that beat, she walked through the main entrance and into the administrative corridor beyond it. Dorian was behind her and to her left, maintaining the 3-foot distance that communicated allied presence without crowding. And she could feel his careful steadiness behind her the way you feel a wall at your back. Not something you lean on, but something that defines the perimeter. The administrative corridor was busy. Mid-morning in a provincial capital's court building meant clerks and advocates and the general human traffic of institutional process proceeding on its own time with its own indifference to emergency. She moved through it with the focus of someone who has identified the one specific desk they need in a room full of desks and is walking a straight line to it, not rudely, not aggressively, just with the quality of directed purpose that parts human traffic more effectively than volume or force. The court clerk's office was at the corridor's end. The door was open. The clerk inside was a man of approximately 40, with the particular quality of someone who has processed 10,000 exceptional situations and developed, as a professional defense mechanism, the ability to appear entirely unbothered by all of them. He looked up when she appeared in his doorway, with the expression of a man who has been interrupted at a task and is determining, rapidly, whether the interruption warrants immediate attention. She said, "Pre-reformed succession statute 14, I need to know the current status of an heir documentation filing under the name Ravenscar, submitted within the last 8 hours. He looked at her. "That is a restricted filing category," he said. "The statute allows the challenging party direct inquiry access before authentication completes," she said. "If you need to verify that, I'll wait while you look it up. But the verification will use time that may be material to whether the challenge can be filed before authentication." He looked at her for 3 more seconds. Then he turned to his filing cabinet. She stood in the doorway, and she breathed and she held the thing inside her at the careful, controlled distance Mira had shown her, not suppressing, not releasing, just holding. The way you hold a lamp steady in wind by adjusting continuously rather than gripping hard. Beside her, just outside the doorway, Dorian stood with his eyes on the corridor. The clerk pulled a file. He looked at it. Something in his expression shifted. A small professional tightening that spoke of a man who has found information he would have preferred not to find. "The Ravenscar filing," he said carefully, "submitted at 6:41 this morning. Authentication is—" He stopped, looked at the file again. Authentication was scheduled for 10 o'clock. She looked at the clock on the clerk's wall. It was 9:53, 7 minutes. "I am filing a challenge under Statute 14, she said. Her voice was level, completely level. "Right now. Tell me what I need to complete the challenge filing in the next 6 minutes. The clerk looked at her over the top of the file. He was doing the same calculation Holt had done, the rapid internal triage of competing risks, the assessment of which outcome was more survivable. She watched him run it. He opened his desk drawer and produced a form. Name, title, relationship to the subject of the filing, and grounds for challenge, he said. He set the form on the desk and held out a pen. She crossed to the desk and took the pen. She wrote her name? She wrote her title. Not the suspended title, the full title, Duchess of House Ravenscar, because the title had been suspended by the Duke, not by the court, and until the court itself processed a formal removal, it was still legally hers. She wrote her relationship. She wrote, for grounds, fraud, fabrication of documentation using prohibited magical means, and conflict of interest of authenticating party. She slid the form back across the desk. The clerk took it, looked at it, looked at the clock, looked at the file in his other hand. The challenge is filed, he said. The authentication is stayed pending review. She breathed. One breath. Just the one. Then she said, How long does the review take? Standard review is 48 hours minimum. Complex cases involving the grounds you've cited, he paused, considerably longer. She nodded. She turned from the desk. She walked out of the clerk's office and back into the corridor, and she kept walking until she reached a side alcove that was empty, and she stopped there. And she put one hand flat against the stone wall, and she stood for approximately 10 seconds, feeling the full dimensions of what had just happened. The filing was stayed. Her child was still a Ravenscar heir. For 48 hours, at minimum. She was also standing in the Imperial Capital's court building with no legal documentation of her identity, a pending accusation of forbidden magic practice, and a Duke's private intelligence operative standing 6 feet away, having just participated in a court filing that would register her location to anyone in Voss's network who had eyes on the court records. The 10 seconds ended. She took her hand off the wall. Dorian was watching her with an expression that was carefully managing something. Not quite relief, because he was too operationally trained for relief, but the specific post-acute stress recalibration of a body that had been running hard and was adjusting to the change in terrain. He'll know within the hour, he said. I know. Voss. And when Voss knows, he tells Lucienne, she said. Yes. She was already moving back toward the main entrance. Dorian fell in beside her. They cleared the guards, the same two who had moved to intercept her and did not move now, which told her that something about the 12 minutes she had spent inside had reclassified her in their internal assessment, or possibly that the clerk had sent a brief verbal signal, or possibly just that the universe occasionally and unpredictably rewards forward motion. Outside, the morning had progressed into full daylight, winter pale and clean, the capital's streets running with their ordinary density. She found Cassian where she had left him, with the cart at the corner of the second side street, and he looked at her face when she reached him and read whatever was on it, with the accuracy of a man who has been reading her for 2 years. It stayed, he said, for 48 hours. Then I have to appear at the review. In person, with documentation, with the mage assessment Cassian was never allowed to complete. She looked at him. Can you complete it now? Officially. Can you produce an official mage classification assessment that carries court-admissible weight? He was quiet for a moment. My official status was suspended. Your credential was not revoked. Suspension and revocation are different legal instruments, and Lucian knows the difference, which means he used the instrument that was sufficient for his immediate purpose and no more. She held his eyes. Can you complete it? Yes, he said. I will need my instruments, which are at the estate. Then we need to get them. The silence that followed had a specific quality, the quality of 3 people simultaneously arriving at the full implication of a sentence. Getting Cassian's instruments meant going to the estate where Lucienne had signed her elimination order, the estate that was, by now, almost certainly aware she was in the capital from Voss's court watchers, the estate where Vivienne was, and where the guards knew her face, and where every variable that had been arrayed against her for 14 months was still arrayed. There's a back way into the North Tower, Cassian said, the same door we used to leave. They'll have found it by now. Probably. He thought for a moment. There's another way. Older. I have not used it in 20 years, but the structure should still be sound. How much time? We reached the estate by early afternoon, in and out within the hour if nothing goes wrong. Back to the capital before nightfall for a full day's buffer before the review. She looked at the sky, thought about the variables, thought about what nothing goes wrong meant in the current configuration of events, which was a phrase that should not be doing any operational load-bearing work given the previous 48 hours. "We go," she said. The drive back took 3 hours. Winter road, winter light, the gray mare moving with her steady, unhurried efficiency, and for the first hour nobody spoke because all three of them were in the particular interior state of people between acute events. The brief still water between rapids, using it not for rest exactly, but for the rapid internal recalibration that sustained forward motion requires. Celine spent the first hour thinking about Lucien. She had been doing it deliberately, in the controlled way she now applied to everything, taking it out, examining it, putting it back without letting it contaminate the operational thinking that had to remain clean. She thought about him with the analytical precision she applied to everything she needed to understand, and did not allow herself the softer responses that were also present, because the softer responses were real, but they were not currently useful. He had signed a document authorizing her elimination. She held that fact, turned it, examined its weight, tried to find the version of Lucien Ravenscar she had actually known. Not the invented version, not the version she had built in her mind from the available material during 2 years of insufficient information, but the real version, the one who was made of actual choices. And she placed that document beside him, and she looked at both, and she asked herself the only question that mattered. Was he doing Voss's bidding completely, or was he doing it with some residual awareness of the thing he was doing? She did not know. That was the honest answer, and she held it without flinching, because not knowing was the accurate position and accuracy was the only foundation she trusted anymore. The estate materialized on the horizon at early afternoon, its towers visible first over the tree line, the familiar geometry of a place she had lived in for 2 years, and that now had the specific uncanny quality of something intimate that has become hostile. The particular cognitive dissonance of a known space redesignated as enemy terrain. She felt it from half a mile out. The thing inside her, responsive to concentrated human presence and intention. The way a tuning fork is responsive to frequency, registered the estate's inhabitedness with a clarity that was still new and still slightly disorienting. Approximately 12 people in the main building, 3 in the stable block, 2 on exterior patrol. She told Cassian what she felt. He looked at her sideways without comment and adjusted their approach to the estate's eastern wall, away from the patrol points she had identified. The old access Cassian had referenced was a drainage tunnel, narrower than the corridor they had used in the other direction, and it ran under the estate's eastern foundation in a way that predated the current structure by at least a century, built for a purpose nobody now remembered and retained by institutional inertia in the way that old infrastructure is always retained, because the cost of removing it exceeds the cost of ignoring it. She moved through it behind Cassian with the gray mare's blanket wrapped around her shoulders for the stone cold and her breathing deliberate and measured, feeling the weight of the estate above her and the people in it with the new ambient awareness that she was still calibrating how to manage. The tunnel brought them up inside the estate's North Tower base, exactly where Cassian had said it would. His instruments were in the tower's upper room, undisturbed. She stood in the doorway while he moved through the space with the quick efficiency of a man who knows exactly where everything is, collecting, organizing, the careful assembly of a specific toolkit that had not been touched in 2 weeks, but was still his, still organized to his system, still arranged by the hands of the person who would know how to use it. She was watching the courtyard through the tower window when she heard the footsteps. Not patrol. Patrol had a rhythm, a cadence, the slightly mechanical quality of people walking a designated route. These footsteps were purposeful in a different way. Directed. Coming toward the tower. She said quietly, "Cassian." He heard it too. He was already closing the case. She moved away from the window and pressed against the tower wall beside the door. And she held the thing inside her at the careful controlled distance, ready, but not released, because releasing it preemptively in an enclosed stone tower was not a decision she was prepared to make about potential collateral consequences. The door opened. Lucien walked in. He was alone. That was the first thing. No guards, no attendants, no architecture of authority around him. Just the man, in riding clothes that suggested he had come in from outside rather than from the main house, his face carrying the specific quality of someone who has been awake for 2 days and has stopped managing the evidence of it. He looked at Cassian first, taking inventory, and then he looked at her. Neither of them spoke for 3 seconds. She had told herself on the road and in the cart, and in every interval of non-operational thought she had allowed herself in the past 48 hours, that she had fully recalibrated around this moment, that she had processed enough, understood enough, dismantled enough of the architecture of what she had built this marriage into, that standing in front of him would produce something manageable. She had believed that. She had been wrong, not in the soft way, not in the way that produced grief or longing or any of the responses she would have predicted. She had been wrong in a harder way. The specific quality of wrongness that comes from discovering that you have accurately described the shape of something without accurately describing its weight. She had known she would feel something. She had not known that what she would feel, looking at his face across the gray stone floor of his own North Tower, was rage. It was clean. That was the thing about it. It was not the hot, undirected rage of a person in acute pain, not the kind that burns through and leaves you emptied. It was cold and structural, and it had been building for 48 hours through every road mile and every waiting minute and every decision she had made in the space his decision had forced her into, and it had arrived at this moment fully formed. She let him see it. She did not manage it, did not compose it, did not put the familiar professional mask over it. She let him see it because she was done making herself smaller, and because he had earned the full undiluted view. Lucien's face, under the exhaustion and the 2 days of unmanaged wear, did something complicated. She watched it happen. The quick sequence of responses, recognition first, then something she could not fully name that moved through his eyes too fast to pin down, and then the setting of his jaw that she recognized as the expression of a man who has come to do something difficult and is reminding himself why he came. "I know where you've been," he said. His voice was rough, not composed. "The court filing, the challenge." "Good," she said. "You shouldn't have come back here." His eyes moved to the case in Cassian's hands. "Whatever you're taking, take it. Leave before your guards find us?" Her voice was not raised. It had the specific carrying quality of something spoken at low volume with complete intention. "You knew I was here before they did. You came alone. Why?" His jaw tightened. "Why, Lucien?" "Because I needed to—" He stopped. Started differently. "What Voss has, the documentation he brought." Another stop. She watched him struggle with the architecture of a sentence that required him to say something he did not have the language for, because he had spent his entire life in a framework where the language for this, for I was wrong, for I was used, for the thing I signed has my name on it, and I am looking at the woman I signed it about, and she is standing in my tower, having survived everything I failed to protect her from. That language had never been built. "I know about the letter," she said. He went very still. "The letter questioning my child's paternity. I know Voss fabricated it. I know what documentation he used. I know the seal authentication technique. I know the specific archival records he accessed. And I know that the Imperial Intelligence Service, the real one, not whatever Voss has been managing through the court council, will find all of it if someone points them at the right location." She held his eyes. "That is not a negotiation. That is just what's true." He looked at her. Something was moving in his face that she had not seen there before. Not the controlled authority, not the managed assessment, not any of the public-facing architecture of the Duke. Something rawer than that. Something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, like a man in the specific state of a person who has hit the bottom of a decision they made too fast, and is standing at the bottom looking up at the distance between where they are and where the decision was made. "The elimination order," he said. The words were flat and effortful, like something being physically extracted. "You signed it." "I was told it was a legal formality, a protective measure for the succession. Voss said—" "I know what Voss said." Her voice did not change. "He's very good at what he says. He spent 14 months building what he said specifically for you, specifically for the way you think and the things you want and the places where you are." She stopped herself, took one breath. "I'm not here to explain Voss to you. You're a man who has run military campaigns and managed an empire's second most powerful duchy for 12 years. You know how political traps work. You know how they're built and what they require and how to identify them." She looked at him steadily. "You chose not to. The silence that followed was very heavy. She told me the child wasn't. I know what she told you. I had documentation, fabricated documentation, that you chose to accept without requesting independent verification, without speaking to Cassian. Her voice stayed level and the rage stayed clean underneath it, structural, load-bearing. Without speaking to me. He said nothing. You could have spoken to me, she said. Once. That is all it would have taken. One conversation. You knew where I was. You knew how to reach me. You had 6 weeks in which you could have walked to any room in the estate where I was present and said to me, there is documentation suggesting something about our child. I need to hear from you directly. Her voice for the first time shifted. Not breaking, nothing so simple as that, but a quality change. The difference between clean cold metal and something with a flaw running through it. 6 weeks! You gave me nothing. You gave Vivienne everything. The flaw ran through the sentence and she let it run because she was done managing the evidence of what this had cost her. That was also something she was done doing. Lucien looked at her and his face was doing the thing that she had spent 2 years occasionally glimpsing in unguarded moments. The underneath face, the one that existed below the Duke, below the authority and the managed capability, and the fortress architecture of a man who had learned in childhood that showing your actual interior was a vulnerability that got used against you. She had seen it rarely. She was seeing it now, fully exposed, because some situations are large enough that the fortress architecture simply fails. Not because the walls come down, but because the person inside them finally understands that the walls no longer make any difference. Tell me what to do, he said. She stared at him. She had not expected that sentence. She had prepared, in the operational part of her mind that was always preparing, for several versions of this conversation, and none of them had contained that sentence. Because Lucien Ravenscar saying, tell me what to do to anyone, was not a sentence her model of him had produced. Voss, she said carefully, his full network, every name you have, every conversation you can remember, every document that passed through your hands in the last 14 months that had his seal or his direction on it. I need all of it, in writing, signed and witnessed. If I give that to you, he will come after you, she said. Yes. He will come after you with everything he has, which is considerable, and he will do it before the court review because he knows what the review will reveal if I appear with Cassian's full assessment and documented evidence of succession fraud. She held his eyes. That is the situation you are in. That is the situation your choice put you in. The question is whether you face it with something on the record or with nothing. His jaw worked. She watched him run the calculation. Not the fast triage that the men on the road had run. Not the magistrate's 2-minute calculation, but the full weight of something that had implications that extended years in every direction. She watched him do it, and she did not help him, and she did not hurry him. I need, he started. The tower door burst open. Not with the theatrical force of dramatic entrance, but with the specific percussive energy of a door opened by someone who has been moving fast and does not slow down for the opening, and the man who came through it was one of Lucien's senior guards. His face carrying the particular quality of someone who is reporting information that has arrived faster than anticipated and is forced to run. My lord. The guard's eyes moved from Lucien to Celine and back with the rapid recalibration of someone encountering an arrangement they had not been briefed on. Voss, he arrived at the gate 20 minutes ago. He has Imperial Court representatives, 6 of them. A breath. He has a secondary challenge override. Filed this morning. Registered by an alternate authentication. He's saying the stay is void. Celine looked at the guard, looked at Lucien, looked at Cassian, who was standing very still with the instrument case in his hands, and whose face had the expression of a man doing rapid legal calculations and arriving at results he does not like. Can he do that? She said to Cassian. Cassian's mouth was tight. If the alternate authentication went through a different circuit, yes, technically. The pre-reform statutes have a secondary override provision that was never removed when the system was updated. It requires 2 court-registered seals, not 1. If he filed it this morning before your stay, he would have had to file it before 9:47. Yes. The courier arrived at the capital at 6:41, she said. He had 3 hours. Cassian said nothing. 3 hours. Voss had been awake and moving and filing before she had even reached the capital, which meant he had predicted her move. Not the specific mechanism, but the broad shape of it, had understood that she would attempt to use the succession challenge statute, and had prepared a counter before she executed the original. He had been 23 steps ahead, and he was now at the gate with 6 Imperial Court representatives and a legal instrument that potentially voided everything she had bought herself in that clerk's office at 9:53 this morning. She looked at Lucien. His face had changed again. The underneath face was gone. Not back to the Duke face, not to the controlled authority, but to something she had not seen before. A third thing. The specific expression of a man who has been standing at the bottom of his own decision looking up and has just understood that the distance is not fixed, that the decision is still in motion, that the thing he signed is still active and its consequences are arriving at his gate, and he is running out of time to decide what kind of man he is going to be when they arrive. "He's coming in," the guard said. "My lord, your orders." The tower was very quiet. Celine kept her eyes on Lucien's face. He was the duke of the second most powerful house in the empire. He had 12 years of uninterrupted authority and the full military and political apparatus of House Ravenscar at his command, and he was standing in his own north tower in riding clothes, looking at the woman he had condemned to the stables, and at the old mage whose warning he had ignored, and at the child she was carrying that he had signed away before it was born, and at the gate where the man who had engineered all of it was arriving with the paperwork to finish what he'd started. The guard was waiting. 6 Imperial Court representatives. Avoid order. Voss at the gate. Every variable she had spent 48 hours moving had just been countered by a man who had been building his response since before she left the estate, and the counter was already in motion, and the only thing between its completion and everything she had fought to protect was the decision of the one man in this room who had, 24 hours ago, signed his name to her destruction. Lucien looked at the guard, and in the 2 seconds before he answered, she felt the thing inside her shift, not releasing, not the preemptive escalation she had been careful to avoid, but something responding to the pressure of the moment the way any living thing responds to the pressure that defines it, by revealing what it is actually made of. The lamplight in the tower room bent, slightly, toward her. Neither of the men noticed. She noticed. Lucien opened his mouth. Lucien said, "Let them wait." The guard blinked. "My lord." "I said let them wait." His voice had the quality of something that has passed through fire and come out the other side. Not louder, not more authoritative in the conventional sense, but with a different density. The specific weight of a sentence spoken by a man who has located underneath everything the one thing he is not willing to trade. "Voss can stand at my gate for 10 minutes. Tell him the Duke is managing estate business." The guard looked at Lucien, at Celine, at the instrument case in Cassian's hands, and completed a rapid private assessment of what kind of estate business this represented. He was a professional. He kept the assessment off his face.